Everybody, thanks for coming to the Warrant Committee meeting tonight. Pleasure to see you all. If you don't mind, I just want to take a minute and say that and recognize that a lot of people in town are mourning the loss of two of our fellow residents from last evening from a terrible tragedy. And just want to say that our thoughts are with those folks and their family and their friends. And begin with a quick moment of silence, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. We're going to begin by looking at the minutes. I just want to point out that there was one amendment. On the second page, Mr. Botello left at 8:30. Should read Mr. Botello left at 9:30. So I've made that change on my paper copy.
Motion to approve the minutes from March 1st as amended.
Second.
Thank you, Maggie. Any discussion? All those in favor? It is unanimous. Thank you very much. All right, so we have two zoning articles on the agenda this evening, and then we're going to host the Town Government Study Committee to talk about the CPO article, and then we're going to continue our discussion on the contingent budget. I'd like to point out that on the two zoning articles, we can and will have our discussion this evening, and we'll hear from some folks that have some information to share with us, but we cannot vote on those two articles tonight. And that is because they're not actually on the warrant in the current form that we're reviewing them in. As you know, they were placed on the warrant months ago, and the Planning Board actually voted on amended language. That language is going to be added to the warrant by the Board of Selectmen, I believe, tomorrow night. So I spoke with Town Council today, and his advice was to hold off on a vote until at least Wednesday, but we can continue on with our discussions. Some folks have also noted that the Planning Board is planning on going back and having a public hearing, a posted public hearing, later in the month, actually the day after our first draft ships to the printer. And I discussed that with the Town Council as well, and that does not create a problem for us because our recommendation on the article is independent of the vote of the Planning Board. It's nice if the two agree with each other, but that is not a requirement. And so in the unlikely event that we end up in different places on March 24th, we could always call the printer and ask them to pull those two articles and put in no recommendation at this time, and we would have to meet in April then and come up with a printed document that would be handed out with the warrant. But let's proceed on with the assumption that we will have a recommendation in time to put into that warrant, and the Planning Board will probably revote their opinion after their public hearing on March 23rd, 24th, somewhere, one of those 2 days. All right, so we're beginning. Does anybody have any questions about that? So the first one listed on the agenda is the Parkway PUD zoning. Why don't we begin with that one? Brian, do you want to join us at the table here, and anybody else you want to bring with you? Or do you want to start? Okay. So if you wouldn't mind just walking us through, this is Brian Furs, Chair of the Planning Board. If you wouldn't mind just walking us through the development of the Parkway PUD, and then I assume Ned and some others have some things they want to talk to us about as well.
Okay, sure. Thank you for having me tonight. The Parkway PUD deals with among others, the location at 487 Blue Hills Parkway, which is commonly known as the Blue Hill Ice or Ice House. This has been a subject of pretty significant debate by the Planning Board that extends back to, I believe, 2 town meetings ago, where the recommendation was made to send back a plan that was shown for that site to send back to the Planning Board for further study. Since then, the the landowner has come back to the Planning Board again with a variety of different iterations of a configuration for this site. As most of you know, in Milton, most of our zoning for pre-existing non-conforming sites is typically done with a development plan in mind, and then zoned in order to try to achieve that plan. In this case, the landowner is not likely to be the developer, so the plan has been presented a bit conceptually, and it's more derived on the basis of what the uses are intended to be, as opposed to a specific plan. The planning board did its best to work within the confines of those uses and rough layouts of what we thought the site would look like, and paid particular mind to what the concerns of the neighbors were in preserving buffers from other residences, from the conservation area, from the parkway itself, and tried to design a bylaw that would be appropriately strict in order to put together a plan that the town thinks it's going to get based on all of the discussions that I've had, but also appropriately open so that the planning board can regulate this plan both from a design standpoint, a traffic impact standpoint, and many other impacts that this will have environmentally. So that's sort of the basis of how we got to where we got. As you walk through it, the plan or the zoning would allow for two buildings, one of no more than 6,000 square foot footprint that could be 2.5 stories tall, and one of no more than 12,500 square feet, which would be intended to be a single-story building. The 12,500 square foot building could accommodate commercial uses, including a market of between 8,000 and 12,500 square feet, and up to two other uses, one of which would be required to be a cafe, and then the third, if there was still room, an additional retail use. The commercial uses cannot total more than 14,500 square feet combined on the entire site. The second building, as I mentioned, would be 6,000 square feet on the ground floor, could be 2.5 stories tall, could accommodate retail on the ground floor, but that would have to be within that 14,500 square feet. And it can contain up to 12 residences. The residences are limited to a studio, 1 bedroom, and 1 bedroom plus den. They cannot be larger than an effective average of all of the units of 750 square feet. And there is a 10% affordability requirement above 10 units. Below 10 units, there would be a required contribution to the Affordable Housing Trust, which would be set by the planning board. Another governing factor here is the floor to area ratio. The floor to area ratio is a pretty common development term. It essentially means the total floor area on all floors as a percentage of the total site acreage, square footage of the site. In this case, the total amount of floor area cannot exceed 30% of the total acreage of the site. And again, there are restrictions on the actual footprints of the building. One cannot exceed 12,500 and the other cannot exceed 6,000 square feet. Another governing factor for the site development is the setbacks, as is common in all zoning articles and zoning. The setbacks from abutting properties from the roadway and from the side property lines, rear property lines, and front property lines are defined. In this case, 60 feet from the roadway, 25 feet from side lot lines, and 50 feet if there's a residence next to them. So if there's a residence on that side lot, it would be 50 feet instead of 25, doubled. And then 40 feet from the rear yard line, which in this case is conservation area. There are pretty typical provisions for building design, which are pretty in keeping with what our typical zoning would require from planning board discretionary standpoints, as well as general building standards and site design standards. Those can be obviously read through, but they're pretty typical, governing everything from lighting and building equipment to the caliper of trees and defining which trees on site should be left and which trees may come down. There's also a provision for bicycle parking in acknowledgement of the very pedestrian and bicycle-oriented uses of the parkway, and an ongoing effort among most commercial development, but especially here in Milton, to make sure that we're accommodating our bike riders. Finally, parking will help to govern the actual uses on site. There are specific guidelines for how many parking spaces should be accommodated for each use, as well as each residence, and there is also a provision for guests. So when you combine the floor area ratio requirements, the setbacks, the specific building footprints that are required, the use governance, and the parking requirements, while there may be some general fluctuation in the exact layout, I think it'll be pretty clear. I think we were all pretty clear on what this site will look like generally, based on the pretty tight guidelines that are here about how things must be designed. There's also guidelines in here for signage, hours of operation, deliveries and waste management. There's a provision for a traffic study, which is going to be very important at this property. This property, as it's on a state parkway, will be governed not only by the planning board, but also by the Mass Department of Transportation. So there will be significant study on traffic and its impacts and what would need to be done to this project to make sure that the traffic impacts, if any, are mitigated. And then there's the typical language that we have regarding applying for a special permit, what the requirements are and how the permit would be issued, requirements for construction, and then interesting thing that the planning board is now adding is that we're requiring neighborhood involvement. So before an applicant may come to the planning board, they must have neighborhood meetings, they must record concerns and questions that the neighborhood raises, and they must document with the planning board what the resolution to those issues and questions is. So we were very careful and deliberate in making sure that the neighborhood would have input into this project when it comes before us, when and if it comes before us.
And how has the, I know, but how has the planning board weighed in on this?
The planning board has had meetings about the Blue Hill Ice site for going on a year and a half now. With regard to this specific bylaw, an article that's in front of us, as you know, the article that was submitted was a warrant, sort of, as much as you don't like the term, a placeholder article. The article was submitted in time for the initial requirement for submission. The planning board then had a number of public meetings, and while they were not hearings, the planning board entertained neighborhood comments at all of those public meetings. Most of those meetings lasted well over an hour, in some cases longer than 2 hours, so that we could get all of that testimony on the table and have a deliberate discussion about the different requirements and that we were going to look to put into this and make sure that we addressed as many of the concerns as possible. We held a public meeting. I apologize, but I don't have the date, but we held our public hearing, advertising as required, accepted testimony again, and then deliberated in a wild planning board. If anybody got to watch, it was pretty good TV, and voted to approve it. And the vote to approve this particular article was 4-0.
Great. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Ned, do you want to come up and talk a little bit as well? Brian, do you mind staying?
Nope, I'll just move over. Just you. Okay.
Do you have anything to add, Ned, before we jump in with some questions?
I just briefly thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am here with Pat McKean, who with his brothers are the owners of the property on the Parkway. They actually grew up there. Some of you may recall we were here and before the town meeting last February with a similar article. It was withdrawn, and I spent a substantial amount of time last year and into this year in a very public process with many neighbor meetings. I hosted 6 meetings at the library with invitations for interested neighbors and others. We had numerous meetings with the planning board. There was a joint meeting actually held in November between the planning board and the selectmen in order to understand whether there was public support. There is a significant amount of public support for this. Keith Schleicher, who is an abutter on the Parkway, has an online petition. There are almost 600 signatures, people who are in favor of this type of a development. And I mapped those signatures, and most of them are within the 4 precincts that surround this property. There are some obviously from other parts of town, but I thought it was particularly important to identify the support within precincts 1, 4, 5, 9, and 10, I think are the 5 that sort of surround this property. We have interest, live interest now that there's actually appears to be activity moving, there's planning board support and hopefully support from this board and from town meeting for a market. I'm engaged with in preliminary conversations with a market that would take the 12,500 square feet in the larger building. There is live interest from a couple of banks who would be interested in taking up to 2,000 square feet in the smaller of the two buildings. There would be residential upstairs from the bank in that building and some number of units. And there is interest in a cafe, and sort of making that all work as it comes forward is interesting. You know, I've had a lot of experience in this town trying to make advanced change among different types of projects, and you know, the reputation of Milton is pretty well earned that change doesn't come easy, and the development community outside of Milton doesn't commit to coming to Milton unless they feel like there's an invitation to come in. So there's guarded optimism among potential market tenants. Proof's got to be in the pudding. They're waiting to see whether or not town meeting will actually vote to approve this article before they will commit to spending money with lawyers, engineers, et cetera, on evaluating the site. So, having said that, we're optimistic. We really appreciate the amount of work that the planning board put into this. We appreciate all the comments from all of the people. We are mindful of the concerns that people have, but we think this is the best plan, this is the best outcome for the site and for the town. And so with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Great, thanks so much. Questions for Ned or Brian?
So this is, I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit. How confident would you be that if this passes at town meeting, that these tenants would sign up for this? Your personal opinion and professional opinion.
I'm very confident in some of them and reasonably confident in others. I have no, at this point, I don't have any reason to believe that we won't get a first-class small market tenant in the property.
Is it challenging to characterize interest in these early stages when it's kind of vague? So I have to imagine interest is a very broad,
Yes.
vague term. So I just kind of want to get a feel for that process a little bit to the extent you can.
It is, and they also are very careful not to allow you to indicate any expression of interest on their behalf. They, having reached back 12 or 15 years when I was involved with the Shaw's Supermarket, we were sworn to secrecy, largely because there was concern that Stop and Shop and others would fight to prevent anything from happening there. So they're very careful not to identify themselves, to allow their names to be used, to have any indication of interest, and I have to be very careful with respect to that level of confidence.
Jean?
Yeah, so is this recognized as spot zoning?
I would say that a claim could be made that it is spot zoning, but as a zoning lawyer, and I share opinions that I've reviewed from many court cases, from the Attorney General's office, from Town Council. I can't speak for Town Council, but spot zoning is not illegal.
I'm sorry?
Spot zoning is legal.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
but it is substantially spot zoning. It's clearly defines a piece of property that has 2 acres or more with 200 feet of frontage on the parkway. There aren't too many pieces of property that fit that description on the parkway. So yes, I would say that it's, it was, and for all intents and purposes, spot zoning, without going through the more typical process of spot zoning, which we like to do, which is zone the site plan. We prefer to see a developer walk in, have negotiations with the planning board around what the site plan will look like and what the uses will look like and how it will be designed. And then we take that site plan and we reduce it to a zoning bylaw like this one, and that's what goes before town meeting. We have pretty pictures and we show them. In this case, we had some concept ideas a year ago. We're not, it could look like those, it could look like something else, but we don't have a developer with tenants sitting in front of us saying, if you zone this, we will build it. really have a more general approach to zoning the spot, which is, these are the uses we'd like to see. There must be a market, there must be, the buildings can only be so big, but it is more general in its description, but it is still fairly specific to the spot.
Ned, when you just said "we like to," I think that people are generally more comfortable seeing a closer to an end product, but that is difficult to do when you're writing zoning for a specific project that then has to go and get special permitting. And I don't know that that's exactly the way that it should ideally work, but "we like to" is probably a pattern that we've fallen into, as opposed to
that's
maybe
right.
a best case scenario.
That's a fair characterization.
Can I ask you, in follow-up to Brian's question, if the current landowner is likely to sell the property and they're not a developer, how is somebody having discussions, even early discussions, with potential tenants, and what would bind them to any particular project?
Well, let's see. The landowner hasn't determined at this point what their approach to specific development is going to be. They're leaning now towards a ground lease, and so staying involved in owning the property. And then either contracting with a developer who would do the development work for them, step away, be paid a fee for the services and step away, or maybe a joint venture partner who would do the development and do it with a piece of the project going forward. There are different ways that we can parse that. I'm obviously the public face and the point of contact for the property. People are calling me because they know that I'm working for the landowner. And, I'm having specific conversations with interested users to say that if you're interested and the zoning passes, then, certainly we will be engaged in a set of conversations that will either lead to my negotiating leases for the property on behalf of the owner, and then securing a development partner to manage the development. That, someone's got to manage the construction, manage the different consultant entities. So that's all fluid. I'm the one who's receiving the calls, and right now the phone's ringing. So,
Brian?
I think it's really important to remember a couple of things in this article that's before us. One is that this is a potential bylaw for a property, for an area. This is while it does apply to a specific site that's been identified, there theoretically is another site in the world, in the world of Milton, that could apply to this site, whether it's by assemblage or whatever. It's very unlikely, but the argument could certainly be made. It's also very important to remember that this is an option that would be put on this property from the standpoint of what could be built here. But it does not eliminate underlying zoning, so someone could certainly still utilize underlying zoning and build something here. It could also still rely on the state's comprehensive 40B permitting to do something else here. So while this is something that the landowner has come to the town with and said this is something that we'd like to consider, this is not and should not be treated as a guarantee of a project. Even if there were contracts in place, I think it would be important to recognize that this is an option, but it doesn't preclude things that are otherwise allowed for the site.
Jonathan?
In the event that the current owner sells, it would be possible for the new owner to start this process again, I presume.
That's exactly what I'm saying now. So they could come to us with an entirely new idea, and we could go through the process again. That would not necessarily eliminate this option. So if someone...
Understood, yes. But I just...
So someone could certainly put another option on the site at that point, yes.
Betty?
I
Or
think that's
seek to
always-
put another option on the
Right,
site.
subject to...
Do you have something to add, Ned?
Yeah, I think that's always true, with respect to any property, really. But it is the McKean's goal to have the property developed in accordance with the way this bylaw was produced.
Betty?
Thank you.
Ned and Brian, last year when this was presented at town meeting, lot of fear about that this development might not be successful and we're gonna end up with a strip mall, and there was all these worries about, these worst-case scenarios. So without divulging any confidential information, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the level of interest, like how many phone calls have you been getting? How many potential tenants are at least looking at the spot? And also, when I think about the residential component, I was wondering about the decision-making and the thought process between making it a rental option versus condominiums.
Maybe I can jump in first. I've had live interest from two market entities. One specifically said 12,500 square feet, which I raised at the end of the hearing last week, when there was debate among the members of the planning board whether the market should be limited to a smaller scale. So 12,500 square feet is the interested level of development. The other tenants would be smaller, a small neighborhood bank. There are a couple of banks that are very interested, A, in becoming a tenant, B, loaning to the project. And then small cafes, either within the market, one of the two that I've talked to has a cafe model within it, or sort of ancillary to it. So I have those conversations. I'm not, there's a small universe of potential tenants out there, and I've had conversations with a number of them, so I think that's about as far as I can go. On the issue of housing, we proposed adding housing because some members, particularly some planning board members, some town meeting members from the neighborhood asked to have housing included. Earl Fay was one, for example, who was opposed to the project last year because it had no housing component. And so, I count votes, and adding housing without adding too much impact, I thought was appropriate. I thought, and I think the planning board agreed, that smaller units, one-bedroom units, would have less impact potentially on town budget because, first of all, you don't want to encourage young families moving in upstairs from a big parking lot and, market uses. So one-bedrooms, studios, where young couples would be walking distance to the Mattapan Square Tea Station, obviously could get downstairs and shop, and would have access to those amenities, would be appropriate. We thought rental rather than condominium because it's possible that through some other form of subsidy, there could be an increase in percentage of affordability if you did more than 10, and you could do 3 as affordables, the town would get credit for all of the units. That's a calculus. I'm not sure, given parking, that you'll get all the way to 12 units, just because of the allowable area of square footage on the ground, plus parking, plus setbacks, plus there's a box, and so the box can move in different directions, but I did think it was important to include housing, and pushed hard to retain housing as an element, really giving it in support to those who were supportive of a mix, but not just a commercial.
Ned, back to your point just a second ago about impact to the town. Have you looked at all at potential tax implications, revenue implications to the town if this plan were maximized?
It's got a rough calculus. The value of the land, if the land is valued at about $2 million, the value of the development might be another $8 million. That's a $10 million value. It's taxed at $23.50 per thousand. I don't know what that, can't do that one on the top of my head, but, and without children, it doesn't have that alternative negative impact, sort of adding kids to the schools. So we think that's overall just a net positive to the town.
Has the planning board looked at that at all?
It's not really our job to think about that, so we have to be careful. But certainly we thought about it. I mean, we certainly were the ones pushing for the 1 and 1.5 bedrooms. We really were trying to be very protective of the school system. We didn't discuss rental versus ownership, and the bylaw frankly doesn't address it, so either would be an option. You know, I think we actually did not spend a lot of time talking about the net gain here, but certainly we would recognize that there would be one. I think it's a little hard for us as the planning board, or even probably as the landowner right now, to understand what the commercial pickup would be, because the commercial pickup will be governed largely by the rent that the
market
tenants
rent.
pay, right? Whereas the market units certainly could be a little bit easier to determine, since they're limited to 750 square feet. You could apply some per square foot number with a real estate broker to that. So, you know, I think we were figuring it was coming out. You know, we didn't talk about it, so I don't want to speculate what the number
Okay.
might be.
Did you
For
come
those
up with
who-
something already for 23.5?
No, I didn't do it.
Come on, you know you
Yeah.
didn't.
For those of you who may have watched the last planning board, I made a big point of saying that, you know, when we get to town meeting, we're voting on door number 1 and door number 2. And door number 2, the alternative to this is 40B. It's a good-sized 40B development, and that's all negative to the town, as far as I'm concerned. And I
What was
think-
really nice about that meeting, not your angry rant at the beginning of it, at the end, was most of the people who have been critical of the plan are pretty constructive about
Yeah.
the zoning as it came out in the end. And it seems like some compromises were made. It seems like the language takes into account the historic nature of the parkway and wanting to protect it and maintain trees. And so it seems like the citizens were heard and concerns were addressed, and I do hear support, and I don't hear a big outcry of people who are very nervous about the project, which is nice to have seen the process progress from last year.
And all members of the planning board really contributed to the development of this language. They listened very carefully. April Lamro, in her last crack at it, really did a great job of sort of picking into some of the specific concerns, and she more significantly rewrote some of the provisions at the tail end of the bylaw to really drill into some of those parkway protections, open space protection issues, which frankly we've always considered to be important, but we've been much more focused, obviously, on the use outcome as opposed to other things.
Brian, did you have something?
Yeah, I want to address the other part of what Betty was talking about with regard to the concern about uses here. If you look at section 2 of this bylaw, the market the project must have a market. And it must have a market of between 8,000 and 12,500 square feet. So if there's not a market, there's not a project. The market also is allowed to sell high-quality wines and beers of not more than 5%, but it's precluded from selling other types of alcoholic beverages. So that was geared towards keeping hard liquor off the site, and so keeping it at a higher end use and making sure that was limited to off-site consumption and at a very low percentage of the overall floor area. This bylaw specifically restricts tobacco and lottery sales. That's to prevent, there was a strong request of the community to avoid convenience stores.
So
And
you
it's
have-
very unlikely that a convenience store will be able to operate without having the ability to sell lottery
But
tickets.
a supermarket, I don't know one that doesn't sell lottery tickets or tobacco. even
Well,
though-
you'll know one soon.
I'm like curious, if these supermarkets might have a
I
concern.
mean, I think your
regarding
larger
that.
Center
supermarkets,
doesn't sell
the
lottery
larger supermarkets do, but I think these smaller format
Right.
markets, I don't think like a Trader Joe's, for instance, would
Okay.
sell lottery tickets. I don't think, that I know the East Milton doesn't sell
Yeah.
them,
Do
so
they
it's
sell
the smaller
tobacco?
format.
No.
No,
Oh, that's good.
no.
But they do sell high-end beer and wine.
Right.
Yes.
And then the last part is that there's only 3 uses here. It's the market, it's a cafe, and it's one other use. So, you know, there's just, unless, let's worst-case scenario this thing out. If you had a market come here and for some reason that market didn't work, unless you were able to replace it with another high-quality market, this applicant is back before the planning board to change whatever the uses are, and the uses will be able to be governed by the planning board. So we've taken real certainty to make sure that this is going to be a high-quality addition from a retail and commercial standpoint to Milton.
Thank you.
Yep, so,
Ned, has the DCR been following developments on this? Are they up to speed, and have they said anything to you about it?
I've had 3 meetings with them to sort of brief them along the way and kind of try to understand their process relative to traffic and safe crossings. They have a process that they follow. There are warrants that would allow or not allow cuts to the median or, implementation of traffic signals. And there'll be a process to follow with them, but they're aware of it. They're aware of the need, at least for a safe crossing. They know that Home Inc. is across the street. There are 98 units with 62 and over there. They know the high school is also directly across the street, but there's a neighborhood just on the other side of Pope's Pond, and that kids cross the brook and then cross over. And they know that there needs to be some form of safe crossing. How that gets designed, how it gets designed in context with the historic nature of the parkway will be an important part of the specific mitigation and design work that would go into it. But they're aware, no commitments. They've explained what their process is, and it's fairly typical of, I worked for a long time at Mass Highway. You've got to come in with a traffic plan, a traffic study. You have to understand who the users would be, how to account for safe deliveries, safe, truck access, safe pedestrian access, safe bicycle access, safe traffic access, and all of that has to work. And they have to agree as to how that would, what would happen with respect to the access to the parkway. They would have to issue an access permit for whatever the new development would be, but they have to issue a permit to allow access to the parkway for the purposes associated with the development.
if the warrant committee is going to recommend this article, either as is or as amended, I wanted to point out a few things in the language. So I put up a draft recommendation because I think that if the warrant committee is in favor of recommending it, there might be some changes we want to make or suggest. And if you don't mind, I'll just walk you through a couple of them. In section 1, I think the numeration is off. It has points 1, 2, and then a second point 2, 3, 4. I think it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to make those changes in this draft recommendation unless anybody has an objection. And there's an extra space before this word, which I'm going to take out. Nobody's concerned? Okay. And then in the second section, development components, find it. Everything changed shape when I bolded it, sorry. The last sentence in this paragraph says, restaurant uses above and beyond the coffee shop expressly permitted above shall not be allowed. I'm a little bit of a stickler for language, and above and beyond is kind of a spatially oriented phrase that is not very exacting language, I don't think. If folks are amenable, I would prefer to say restaurant uses except for the coffee shop expressly permitted above shall not be allowed.
Sounds good.
Restaurant uses except for the coffee shop expressly permitted above shall not be allowed. Anybody worried about that? Okay. I had asked Brian a question about this FAR calculation, which I'll just point out. He mentioned it in his opening comments as well, the floor to area ratio. I was wondering if this needed to say the total square footage of all stories of all buildings, because I didn't want there to be confusion between sort of the ground floor square footage and I was educated that this is a pretty standard industry term, and that is not a concern that most people would have. So I just wanted to let folks know that I had considered that, but it seemed like it wasn't a concern. But I did have a question, Brian, for you on this setbacks. It says that Buildings shall be set back at least 60 feet from the lot line along the parkway, at least 25 feet from any side lot line, and at least 50 feet from any residential dwelling on an abutting parking lot, on an abutting lot, and at least 40 feet from a rear lot line. It struck me that this doesn't say any residential dwelling that exists as of X date or something like that, because what happens if between when this gets passed and when somebody goes to try to get a special permit and a new residence pops up or changes your plan? I'm just wondering what impact that could potentially have, knowing that this is multi-site specific in theory. We're really talking about one site, probably. Or specifically anyway, it would affect the ice house site, and I was wondering if that was a concern for the landowner.
No, it's not. It's, the property is actually, it fronts on the parkway. On the northerly, it's a perfect rectangle. It's 255 feet by 350 feet. On the northerly side, it's bounded by town-owned conservation land. On the westerly side, it's bounded by the Pope's Pond Conservation Area. It comes around about 40% of the lot area coming back towards the parkway, and then there's one single-family dwelling. That dwelling is actually non-compliant with zoning because it's almost on the lot line. So you would have to draw an arc 50 feet off of that dwelling to show the setback of any building off of that dwelling, but otherwise,
So no concerns about changes that could take
setbacks
place?
are, we did a test fit, and we think we can fit.
And from the standpoint that this is arguably not site-specific, because there's conservation land protecting the other side lot line, I think we would like to protect residential dwellings perpetually.
Okay. Another one in section 4, talking about the facade of the residential building. Okay, so the language switches a little bit here and reverts back to, I think, language that was in the last draft. And so in this draft, you're mostly talking about a commercial building and a residential building. But in this paragraph, they used the term the second building. And I'm just trying to find that. Any arcade to a depth of 10 feet. The second building. So when you say the second building, I think that you mean the residential building. It doesn't reference the second building up above anymore. I don't think it used to in the old copy. And I think that it would be clearer. The sentence is talking about the residential building, and then it calls it the second building. And I'm afraid that that implies that then you're referring back to the other building. I think it would be clearer if instead of saying second building, you just said residential building.
So I did look into that a little bit, having received your question in advance. The building does allow for commercial use, so you should call it, if you're going to change the language, you should refer to it as a mixed-use building, probably.
Or the non-market building.
Or the non-market building.
Okay. But I thought it was being called the residential building in other places. Can I just look at that for a second?
You're right. In that paragraph, it specifically refers to it as the residential building.
Yeah. I was trying to find where it was defined. I thought earlier on where it was setting up the two buildings that set like a precedence that it was going to say hereafter referred to as
Top of
the...
page 2, it says the residential building again, and it says referred to as the residential building, so I
Yeah,
think you're right.
in
It
quote.
does define it. Yeah.
Do they say it in that same paragraph? Which, Steve, which paragraph are you looking at?
Top of page 2,
Okay.
in addition to the food market, the second building, it's the third line, the second building may contain a floor
My top of page 2 says, in addition to the commercial areas, any development shall... What paragraph are you in? You're in, I'm sorry, you're in section 2, development components, in the second paragraph? Is that where you are?
different version.
Oh, you have the older version? Okay. So right now, in section 2, in the top of the second paragraph, what Brian was just reading, it says, I'll put it on the screen. In addition to the commercial areas, any development shall permit up to 12 residential units in a separate building not to exceed 10,000 square feet, herein after referred to as the residential building. I don't see any reference to it being the second building.
So I'd withdraw my comment then.
Okay. So my suggestion then would be in this paragraph in section 4, instead of saying the second building shall have a pitched mansard roof, I think it should say the residential building. Going once?
I second that.
And then, thanks, and then 2 lines down, it says, the use or uses in the second building provided that these facades are compatible. So I would change that as well to residential. And then it says it that way in the last sentence in that paragraph. The residential building shall not exceed 35 feet in height. Anybody concerned about those proposed changes? Almost done. Section 6B. Species shall be approved by the Shade Tree Committee. I think it's really called the Shade Tree Advisory Committee with capitals. I only know that because it's referenced in the other PUD that we're going to look at.
We checked it in that PUD.
So if you don't mind, I would change this to the Shade Tree Advisory Committee. Is everybody okay with that? And then this might be the last one, 8. We generally capitalize our boards and committees, and this says subject to the Conservation Commission.
Where are you?
Paragraph 8, first sentence, says Conservation Commission, referring to the Milton Conservation Commission, so I capitalize those Cs. Anybody concerned about that? Very last change. Just missed a period after this header. All the other headers have a period after them, including in the other PUD, so I would suggest putting that there. Mr. First?
You had a question that you asked me about section 7 on parking. With regard to the language about the standards for parking areas set out in section 7 shall not be applicable.
Yep. Oh. Okay. I forgot about that one.
I did not have an opportunity to review the entire section 7 against this, but it's a pretty lengthy section. It may make sense to leave section 7 in place, but allow the provisions of this section 7 to supersede the where applicable. So
Well, we're not
I leave
gonna-
that to I leave that to the warrant committee to look at.
Well, I would prefer not to read the whole parking bylaw, but what my concern was that I shared with Brian the other night was that it says that, let's see, it says the standards for parking areas set out in section 7, meaning of the general bylaws, shall not be applicable. And I think it means that it wants to follow these standards, but it just struck me that probably the standards set out in section 7 were more lengthy and took more things into account, and I wasn't sure if we were accidentally striking other things that we would want to include that weren't thought about in this small paragraph. So I was just asking the question, and we're not going to vote on this, Brian, until Wednesday night, so if you want to talk with either town council or the planning department and see if there's any other unintended consequences of making section 7 not applicable, you could let me know, send an email, and I'll share it with the committee so that we can consider it before we vote on this. Ned, do you have anything on that?
I don't, I hadn't thought about it. I'll take a look at it.
Okay. Any other questions or concerns? Yeah.
Yeah. If the language doesn't specifically say no fast food, if it just doesn't jump right out at you, how do we know that's not going to happen?
It actually will be, it's actually more specific than even that. It says no restaurants are allowed other than a cafe.
Okay.
So,
But where it says, any development shall include a coffee shop, a cafe with seating,
I see, yeah.
okay? Or other prepared foods and beverages available to customers for their consumption on premises. How is that, who's going to say, you can't take that home? Who's going to say if you stand in line,
I don't think there's any expectation that you wouldn't take it home, at least contemplated here. I mean, I'm not speaking for town council, but I think you could absolutely have a coffee shop where you could take something away here, based on what I'm reading here.
so there's no language in here that's going to permit a McDonald's or there's no way you can twist this language around.
I don't think you could get a McDonald's, they want drive-through.
I'm sorry?
They would want a drive-through, there's no drive-through allowed.
Lots of times you go into these markets and they have a little booth. They have so that would be okay
Yes.
under these.
Yeah, I mean, it expressly allows for the cafe to be within the market. There's,
Or outside of
There are
it.
two things.
but it also expressly allows for the market, for the cafe to be outside of the market. And a cafe is defined as something with seating where donuts, muffins, sandwiches, and/or other prepared foods and non-alcoholic beverages are available for customers for their consumption on the premises. You could make an argument, I think, that they're not available for off the premises
Well,
based on that language.
I did have this conversation with April Lamoureux, who drafted this, because I had a similar question. It seemed to me that coffee shop or cafe could include a Panera Bread, which is maybe just one step above McDonald's in some people's opinion. And so I called her to talk with her about that, if that was her intention, or if she was trying to find a way to avoid that, or a specific type of development. And she mentioned to me that if the supermarket is maximized in space, which Ned had said at the last meeting was the intention, then it leaves much smaller square footage available to a cafe or coffee shop, which would pretty much prohibit most of those undesirable fast food establishments because they're going to be really small. And so she said that by definition, the size would, she said the size would likely dictate that it was more like a small coffee shop rather than a fast food restaurant.
Yeah, well, more like a Dunkin' Donuts, so.
Could be.
So I just find this I find it very elusive. That's all. I can't really get my hands over, you keep talking about high quality and, you know, what you want in there might be what you might not get. That's all, my point. So this just goes all over the place as far as I'm concerned.
That's right, there's a little bit of a leap of faith.
Yeah.
You know, the two things that the public really ask for is a market and a cafe meetings place. They want to have a place to go and have a cup of coffee or have lunch with friends, and there's no place like that outside of East Milton. And so that was a strong desire. I think the planning board was working towards a definition that would fit that, would be, you know, the scale would be appropriate. They're not allowed to have a drive-through, which would restrict the interest of some. You know, Dunkin' Donuts likely wouldn't come here unless it had access to a drive-through. It's possible that they would want to, but, you know, McDonald's isn't coming without a drive-through. So, you're right. I mean, it's hard to define when there's so many different models out there, but that's the goal, is to have a small, you know, maximize the market, have a small other component where people can come and sit and
Yeah,
enjoy the outside.
I'm not anxious to replicate East Milton Square on the Parkway. And so that you can control that, can you absolutely control that? I understand you can't, but I would like that tightened up, whether that can happen or not. I don't know.
Michael?
Speaking of East Milton Square, just to get an idea, Brian, do you know the size of the fruit center square footage? How does it compare to this?
The Fruit Center building is 20 over 20 approximately, 20,000 square feet over 20,000 square feet, and the market occupies, I believe, about 14,000 or 12,000 square feet on the first floor. It's 12 or 14,000 on the first floor.
Thanks.
So this would be slightly smaller.
I was trying to imagine like how many square feet that could be, and I thought, I'll just ask you.
We actually did discuss it. and I just can't remember the exact numbers, but it was this, at 12,500, I believe, that at its largest size, this would be slightly smaller than the East Milton Marketplace.
I think the other component of that is that the market, the fruit center market is, the fruit center is the market, CVS on the first floor, the plate, and 3 or 4 other retailers on the second floor. You have all retail or restaurant. This would be a market, 2,000 square feet of other commercial, and then a small number of residential units upstairs, which has a completely different impact on traffic, on the need for parking, on things like that. I think it's a much less, it's less impactful. I'm not going to say it's much. In my opinion, it's much, but it's less impactful than if you had, 2 floors of all commercial, particularly with the nature of the retail.
Anybody else? Question or Maggie?
First of all, I just want to congratulate you guys because the planning board, in my opinion, has worked so hard and diligently on getting to this point. I mean, to me, it seems like you've put a lot of thought and effort into having a really great commercial area for the people in that part of town, and I agree, they really do want that. It seems that everyone is mostly on board. You can't please everyone, you try your best. But I have one question. It's under the part where you say that the plantings and you describe what they're going to do, only because I was...
Which section is it?
It's under section 6, site design standards, under B, about the caliber and about the shade tree advisory committee. Who follows up to ensure this happens? Because I'm in the Central Avenue area, and when they did the development for Central Avenue, the condo association there, I mean, it's beautiful, it's great, but as part of those documents, they were to maintain the trees on the other side of the brook behind Mackey's Barber Shop. It's barren, nothing. On the other side, it's beautiful. So once everyone goes away, who's in charge of following up and making sure that it maintains the beauty and this is in fact happening?
So the application would include a site plan that would include a landscaping plan and requirements for landscaping, specifying the species, specifying the caliper. The conditions of the special permit would outline requirements for maintenance and whatnot. At that point, it's building inspectional services that's required to maintain that. So if there's a concern about a specific project and if a complaint is filed with inspectional services, they'll go back to the original application materials, they'll look at what the special permit says and what the special permit plans say, and they'll make a ruling on what needs to be done, if anything.
So you mean I can go back to inspectional services, this is not about this, on Central Ave and tell them to put the trees back? Because it looks horrible.
Enforce the codes.
You'll recall that Joe said that he doesn't have time to respond to those types of complaints because he's understaffed, but...
Right, he's looking for additional staff to do that.
That's true.
Okay.
No, thank
Anything
you very
else
much,
on
guys.
the Parkway PUD? All right, well, we'll hold deliberation on our recommendation until Wednesday, and if there is anything you want us to consider about the parking, please let us know if you don't mind.
I'll have planning staff check that and report back, probably Julia or you, Mr. Chair, and give you an opinion on that.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you all very much.
Sure, thanks, Ned. So I'm pulling up the Great Estate, and do you want to do this the same way? Brian, do you
Yep,
want to talk
that's
about this
fine.
for a few minutes?
Sure.
You can stay if you want, Ned. You're going to come back in a minute anyhow.
Okay.
This one actually has a site plan.
Yep, so I printed out the wrong one, so you can, I actually printed out this one twice, so I'll just look at the board.
Okay.
So I might have to ask you to scroll down. So this is for
Pass that
the,
over.
yep, so this is for the Carberry property. I think as everybody mostly knows it, the Carberry Estate. We've deemed it the Great Estate Plan Unit Development. And the idea behind this is that this is a just under 49 acre or 48 acre parcel of land on Upper Canton Avenue. It has beautiful vistas from Canton Avenue, of long sweeping meadows, beautiful stone walls, large groves and stands of trees, and I forget how many exact houses are up there. I believe it's 6 or 7 homes on the property today, 3 of which the planning board has deemed historically significant and worthy of keeping in this bylaw and requires them to be kept. Those are the Manor House, which is the large home you can see at the top of the lawn as you drive on Canton Avenue, specifically towards Canton. There are 2 others. One is the Governor Stoughton House, and the other one is the Walcott House. Thank you. And those are both not very visible from Canton Avenue. You might be able to see Walcott from the road occasionally, but for the most part, those are just on the property. This bylaw was brought to us by Mr. Corcoran for an application for a site plan that's coming around before you. This site plan has been significantly changed from what came to us originally, which I think showed 72 units. 75 units. It's been, after much debate with the community and the planning board and many discussions, reduced at this point to 58 units. The planning board has worked very hard to craft language here that protects as best as possible the groves of trees, the vistas from Canton Avenue, the stone walls, 3 homes I spoke of. Abutters were very much a part of this conversation. Mr. Kevin Walker is on I believe it would be the westerly side of the property, and Carberry Lane is on the easterly side of the property. And there was much testimony, both in the public hearings and in the public meetings preceding the public hearings, from all of the abutters. There's still a fairly significant contingent of abutters that would like to see this development be smaller, at 44 units. And the planning board did take that into consideration. Apparently there's a process in place right now amongst the abutters to try to come up with a benefactor that would buy down the unit count by purchasing a portion of the rights essentially and restricting this to the 44 units, and the planning board would certainly be open to that. But I think the thinking was that as the scoping of town meeting warrant articles allow you to go down, the planning board's thinking was that we would go with the 58, which is what the negotiations with the applicant finally resulted in with the planning board, with the knowledge that this number could certainly be reduced at town meeting if it was appropriate at that time. Again, I don't have the language specifically in front of me, but I can tell you that it's the language was derived from the language that was put together for the Woodmere development on Brush Hill Road, which is 36 units, which are currently under construction. This would currently be the same developer. Nothing says that it would absolutely be the same developer, but the same developer of Woodmere is currently the owner of the land and is working to put this bylaw together with us. The project is deemed age-restricted. While Woodmere is designed to be age-restricted, it is not actually age-restricted. This project is actually age-restricted. That led to an interesting discussion about the affordability portion of this project. The affordability is actually allowed to be off-site, either in units that would be purchased by the developer off-site somewhere and then brought to the planning board for approval, on the town farm site, which would be coordinated with the Board of Selectmen, and again, at the discretion and approval of the planning board, or in a worst-case situation, which is not desirable from the planning board's perspective, by a contribution to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. The reason that the planning board did not have concerns about having the units off-site is that we believe that there's already a significant number of age-restricted affordable units in Milton, and there's not a significant number of affordable units for non-age-restricted young families, workforce housing, that type of thing. So by moving these units off-site, we're actually increasing the opportunity for young people that live in these homes, workforce housing to live in these homes, and certainly the elderly could also live in these homes. So it just allowed us to have a much more eclectic and diverse affordable housing supply, which we think is much needed in the town. So that's why we agreed to let the units be off-site as opposed to on-site. Significant design standards from both a site standpoint and a building standpoint. This bylaw you will find to be far more specific in its requirement for keeping trees, what the site design would require, where the roads are, where the buildings can be, the specific layout of the buildings. There were concerns raised about the Woodmere project, that there was a predominance of garage doors in the architecture. That's actually been specifically addressed here to try to encourage a more diverse architecture and avoid that in the future. So because there was a specific plan in front of us, because the developer was at the table with us, we were able to, again, be much more specific in crafting a bylaw that we think will get us close to this plan, and certainly require a trip back to the planning board and perhaps even to it's going to require a trip to the planning board regardless, because again, as I said before, this is just the bylaw. This will require special permit applications, traffic impact studies, and whatnot. I do believe a significant alteration from this plan would require a trip back to warrant committee and subsequently town meeting, because we have tried to be pretty specific in what we're allowing and not allowing here.
Ed, do you have anything you want to add to that before we ask questions?
Yeah, so I'm representing Northland Residential, which is the developer and owner of the property. They own 19 acres, and the balance of the property, the total lot is 47 acres. The balance of the property, Northland has under agreement. And the Carberries actually drove a pretty interesting bargain. They required my guy to get pregnant, and he actually had to buy one portion of the property and own it while he sought permits to do the entirety. It wasn't going to be a situation where 3 years of effort or 4 years of effort resulted in no project and he walked away and the Carberries were left with the property. So they made him buy the property, get skin in the game. So we started out with a plan that was 75 units. And through a series of initial conversations with neighbors, we dropped it to 64. And then at the request of some of the neighbors, we reduced it again to 58 under the notion that we could develop 6 affordable units elsewhere in town. And so we met with the Affordable Housing Trust to talk about the efficacy of that. Was that something that would meet with their goals? And they agreed that, you know, an important goal of the affordable housing, as Brian indicated, is to provide housing for younger families. And we've been actively engaged in making offers on distressed properties. There are properties out there that are in receivership, are in foreclosure, tax foreclosure, where they've been abandoned for a couple of years. And if we can acquire those, build new, and then sell at the restricted prices, then young families could purchase and move into neighborhoods with other families. There's 2 properties on Thatcher Street. There's one on Brook Road. There's one further out on Canton Avenue. There's a half a dozen sites, properties that we've looked at and we're in communications with. And so we're reasonably confident that we could produce that type of plan. So based on that, what we have said, and we were, again, very firm in our conversations with the planning board, was that 58 market rate units, age restricted to 55 and over, would be the minimum number of units that would be built on this site. And I think, you know, we've had a lot of interesting dialogue with neighbors. Not all of the neighbors are on board with that. But I think that there's a consensus among the planning board that this was a good outcome, and this is and so we're pleased with the outcome of the planning board's work. They liked the ice house. They put in a lot of time. There were lots of public meetings and lots of public hearings on this approach, and so we're pleased with the outcome, and we're looking forward to meeting with, you know, as a meeting tonight, and then obviously with town meeting later on.
Brian?
A couple of the things I should have added that I added in the last meeting, or the last hearing. This was voted 4-1 by the planning board, so there was a one dissenting vote. And I did want to just mention the fact that we did require the applicant or the warrant article submission to study alternative plans. So in addition to hearing about the 40B project, which was potentially in the background, we did ask them to also look at what the site would look like with conforming to the existing zoning. Either AA residential zoning, which would be around 24 2-acre lots, or a cluster development. And ultimately, in both cases, we believe that the site would be very significantly impaired from an aesthetic standpoint from Canton Avenue. If you divide a 49-acre parcel into 24 equal-sized lots, you will not end up with something that maintains the integrity of the vistas and the views from Canton Avenue. You'll end up with 24 manicured lawns that will be much, much different than what you have there today. And one of the resounding things we heard from all of the abutters, whether they agreed with the unit count or otherwise, was that they were very concerned about preserving the visual integrity of this site. And that was a big factor in our ultimate determination to move forward with this warrant article in recommending it.
And I would also add that was really the starting point with Jack Dolly's approach to the development of this property, that there are elements to this property that are so significant and contribute to the value analysis for all of Upper Canton Avenue. If you think about coming in from the Trailside Museum and taking that right onto Canton Avenue, there's this beautiful property with the beautiful lawns and the vistas into the property. You've got the next estate, just blanking on it now, and then you have the Eustis Estate. You've got three beautiful old estates. The other two have been acquired and are in preservation. This is the last that was available for redevelopment, and really the starting point was, what do you see from Canton Avenue? And what you see is what you should still see. And so the setbacks are 250 feet at a minimum. The grove of buildings on the right-hand side of the new roadway in are set behind a grove of pine trees, and those pine trees would remain. And everything else is up into the property and substantially invisible from Canton Avenue. The setbacks from surrounding are significant, and so there's really an effort to pay attention to that.
Does anybody remember what the open space requirement is in the cluster zoning bylaw that's on the books now?
35%.
Okay, and this one requires 60%. What is the percent open space that the developer's at now with this 58-unit plan that we have in front of us?
It's a minimum of 60.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is above that number, but it's a minimum of 60.
But you presumably could have fit more buildings on this and still have had a minimum of 60% open space.
We had, at 75 units, we had 50%. We had 50% open space.
Okay. The bylaw must have been different then?
The initial bylaw, the initial plan had...
That wouldn't have fit this bylaw at 60%.
The 60% open space came in...
Later?
Late.
Okay.
It was always 50.
But you think, so you're above 60 at least? Okay. I was just thinking of your comment that you just made there, Brian, about the alternative plan, and if they had used the existing bylaw for cluster zoning, I was thinking you probably could have got a lot more units on this property.
No, we were asked to evaluate a couple of things. One was, what can you do as of right under AA zoning? 80,000 square foot house lots, you could put 22 single-family house lots, small McMansions with swimming pools and manicured lawns, and you would, with new roadways, and you'd blow up the site. You would see just all new development. We then were asked to look at a development under the town's cluster bylaw, which has a minimum of 35% open space. So using a calculus that's available within that bylaw, we're able to achieve 33 units. The lots, they're still single-family house lots. The minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet. Feeling was that they really would need to be in the 3/4 acre size to be consistent with development out there and for value. But again, you end up with single families with swimming pools. You build Carberry Lane with some setback along the front and some setback around. And this is a comparison, pass it around, that's a comparison of the proposed plan with a 33-lot clustered subdivision that would preserve 35% open space.
But that would have been a different product, the 33. It wouldn't have been these
It'd have been single-family
Yeah.
houses, lots, single-family lots, and would have significant impact upon the real treasure of the property, which is that frontage and the lawns
And the schools, I would imagine.
and you could 33 new families.
Is there any, thank you, forecast at this point as to the potential new tax revenue to the town under any of these scenarios?
Under the 58 unit scenario, I think we're saying if you assume, I think we're saying somewhere in the neighborhood of $900,000 in new tax revenue, 58 units, if you assume $1 million, $1.2 million per unit.
Is that net of what is currently being paid in taxes on the property?
I don't know, I haven't done a net
Okay.
calculation, but it's essentially, we think 58 market rate units at $13.50 per thousand, it's roughs out to about $930,000. Now, 6 new affordables elsewhere with 6 families would have some impact to schools. I haven't factored that component into it.
Okay.
Certainly, if you build 33 new single-family homes, it would be 30 market rate units with, assume 49 and a half children. We think it'd be a negative of about $25,000 on the school.
If memory serves, I think you did a slide similar to that calculus for, maybe it was Ice House last year?
I think I did it 2 years ago for
Okay.
the St. Pius.
All right, so St. Pius at town meeting, I think you presented that slide. I would recommend, if you're going to get up and speak at town meeting, that you prepare a similar revenue analysis. I think it's helpful for people to understand the different impacts, the downstream impacts, besides just the views from the street, which are important. There are also real significant budget impacts as well. Okay, thank you. What questions do folks have? Yes, Jonathan?
2 questions. One, is this a public road?
No, this would be a private way. The existing, there are 3 existing driveways. There's the driveway that comes up to the manor house. There's the middle driveway that comes up to, the one thing that's different from this plan, from what's in the zoning, is that the first building that you see, rather than new units, is going to be one of the preserved buildings. It's built pre-1950. It's not historic, but it has significance to the neighborhood from a view perspective. And one of the important things is that middle driveway, which is a straight shot, and when you come down straight across the street into a driveway. The plan is to move it to the right and bring it down to a point where it doesn't come out to anybody's driveway. There's actually,
I see.
it's not visible really from that house that it comes down to. It swings around a grove of trees. There's an important set of significant mature trees there, so it swings around that. The third driveway on the right, it currently comes all the way up to what's known as the Governor Walcott House. It's the other historic building. Governor Walcott grew up in that house. That driveway would be discontinued, and the Walker residence, which is to the right, would enjoy sole access off that driveway. That's currently, they have an easement to use that driveway now. We terminate that. And so the new roads The one on the left would remain, but it would be gated, and so there would be no regular access to and from Canton Avenue. Be emergency access only. The one new road system would be privately owned. It would be owned and maintained by the condominium association. It would not become a public way. It would not become a burden on the town in that regard.
And one other question, I guess it's the southern side of the property, is that Blue Hills?
Yes.
Okay.
It's surrounded on the upper right and in the rear by the Blue Hill Reservation. The Carberry family used to own an additional 30 acres up top, 30-plus acres that were acquired by then MDC in the early 1990s for part of the Blue Hill Reservation.
Okay. And finally, along the, well, right here you show some sort of way. Is that a,
That is
Is that a
actually a
trail?
trail.
it is, okay. All right, thank you.
It's the Walcott Trail, and then there's another trail that comes through what used to be the Carberry property above, and then there's a small trail that comes in through the upper corner on the left.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Maggie?
Are you planning, I think I'm reading this, hooking up to a septic system as opposed to the water and sewer for the town? Probably it would require too much money to do it the other way. And do you have any idea where you plan on putting it and how you plan on doing it within the property?
Those are more detailed engineering
Oh.
work that's ongoing, but there is, under Title V, which is the state's sewer septic program, age-restricted developments are calculated from a water use standing differently than single-family houses with bedrooms.
Right.
And so the volume of water is less than what would be necessary to either do on-site treatment or even tie to sewer. We think we can do it with a fairly simple leach field, and there's plenty of room on the site to account for some underground utilities, such as the undergrounding of septic and stormwater detention areas, while still preserving
The open space? Thank you.
Can I veer us back to the number of units again for a minute? Brian, we received a number of communications, at least 3, from abutters and the Blue Hill Neighborhood Association concerned about the total number of units. And I know that you've heard similar things at the planning board, and I was wondering if you could just walk us through how the planning board came to be comfortable with the number, that they did vote for one, and what your criteria was for deciding on what was reasonable for the neighborhood.
Certainly. I guess the first thing point I want to make is one that I made on the last presentation, which is that this is a zoning article. This is not a site plan approval. This is not a special permit. So this would allow up to 58 units, but that would be assuming that all sorts of requirements of the planning board were met, including making sure that there was going to be no substantial traffic impact, that the sewer or septic could be accommodated, that all of the correct trees can be preserved, and on and on and on. So this allows for up to 58 units, but that would be on the basis that the special permit could be achieved for 58 units and meet all of the conditions. Again, I think the planning board heard from the community heard from the original submission that that they saw an application for 75 units. Up until the last meeting, the applicant was very much a stickler for 64. And I think the planning board pushed back very aggressively to get it to 58 and essentially said, you know, it's 58 units. And you can go off-site with your 6, but it's 58 units. We definitely heard, as I mentioned earlier, from the community that there's an interest for 44. The applicant made it very clear to us that 44 was not going to be something that moved this project forward. So the planning board felt pretty strongly that it had to balance preserving this incredibly unique site in our community, one that frankly was probably one of the reasons that our condominium working committee stopped its efforts until this site was determined, because it was determined that this is one of the few sites in town that everybody can agree needs to be treated very specially and in a very distinct way as it's permitted. We had to balance protecting that site with potentially losing it to a conforming development or a 40B project or something along those lines. And we certainly understand that a lot of the abutters and a lot of the neighbors were disappointed that we went with the 58 as opposed to the 44. We've made it clear that we're amenable to the 44 if that can be reached, and that the town meeting will certainly have the opportunity to lower it to 44. But it was very important to us as the planning board that we do everything we could to try to balance having a site that was going to be developed that wasn't going to be detrimental to the overall aesthetic of Canton Avenue, and that's where we came out.
And I would add that those negotiations were difficult. I mean, we drew an absolute bottom line, 58 market rate units on the site, unless someone comes along and buys down the unit count. We would not agree any way, shape, or form to reduce the number below 58. We did agree, we were very concerned about the risk of trying to buy and produce 6 affordables elsewhere, because the notion of our inability to produce 6 units elsewhere could reduce the number of market rate units on this site to 52, if 58 is the maximum number of units that you can build. But we're confident with the language. There was a last final negotiation on some form of cash buyout based on a net cost of producing a unit. You know, each time a developer produces a unit, costs him about $400,000 to $450,000 to build the unit, and he can only sell it for $230,000. So there's a net cost for each of those developments, and we know that. There's a couple of $1 million cost, two and change net cost total if we can't produce those 6 units. So we got comfortable with our ability to manage that production of units, but we were very, very firm that if the planning board went to a lower number, we wouldn't be here tonight. We wouldn't be having this discussion.
Other questions or comments? Yep.
Is this, or some or all of this presently taxed agricultural or residential?
It's all residential.
All residential.
There are at least 5 of the buildings are occupied.
Michael?
Was there any comments that the neighborhood made about public access to this site after it's all built?
Yes, there were lots of comments about it. The site allows for, might even require parking.
I'm sorry.
It will actually require parking for access to the trails. It either requires it or allows for it. I think it allows for it, for parking on the trails. But there is a walking path that's established along the front of the property. There's no sidewalks on Canton Avenue, so this will actually provide a sheltered walking path for a pretty significant distance along Canton Avenue, inside of the stone wall. And then again, there will be no, the planning board was careful to point out that it would not want to see gates here, that the roadways would be open to pedestrians and bikers to be able to go in through the property, and it's likely that there will be trail access from the property as well.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, it's nice to preserve a gem and let people see it.
In fact, we met with DCR to talk to them about this property as well. They actually will require us to develop a trailhead that's consistent with their other trail accesses, with a kiosk and access for emergency vehicle into the Carberry Path. There were requests from several within the neighborhood to allow access to the system. We do provide for a small number of parking spaces up near the trail access at the top of the property. There will be a walking path that's along the entire frontage of the property inside the stone wall. That is the frontage of the property, so that there is some public, and then there'll be other sort of trail access through, but that was an important ask, and it's one that, the condominium association will have to live with. There is public access.
And just as a follow, so currently, you'd be trespassing if you went on the property now?
Don't go.
We have had some, we did
Oh, wait.
host a couple of site walks, and it's quite something.
Maggie?
I noticed on your site plan, you have the emergency access drive. Is that specifically for the emergency personnel use, no one else's use?
If the committee were to decide on Wednesday to vote on a recommendation that's substantially similar to the article that I think the Board of Selectmen is going to put on the warrant tomorrow night, there are just a few changes that I would suggest. And they're not nearly as numerous as in the other article, probably because this is based on existing zoning. But I just wanted to call folks' attention to paragraph 9. I think you want this underlined in its entirety, not just the words affordable housing, to match all the other headers.
Provision about affordable housing.
Yeah. And then section 13(4). There's a extra period here and 2 spaces. That out. Same issue on section 18. Period and a couple of spaces. Take that out. Any concerns over those changes? Okay. So what other questions or concerns do folks have before we put this one on hold until Wednesday? Yes? Would you like to come to the table?
Are neighbors permitted to speak at this meeting?
The Warrant Committee does not have a public speak process, and I did invite folks to submit letters, and we did receive a couple, and I did circulate them to everybody, but we do encourage the public to submit their comments through the elected boards in town as opposed to at the Warrant Committee deliberations. However, if you still want to submit something in writing, we're not going to vote on this until Wednesday, and also the moderator does open up the opportunity for residents to speak at town meeting before the vote there. Okay.
Well, I would just point out there are quite a few neighbors here.
You're going to speak anyway? Yeah.
Who would like this committee to understand that the vast majority of
Why don't I invite up a couple of you? And when we went through budget deliberations, we did limit folks to 3 minutes each. And does anybody else have anything else for either Ned or Brian? I have something general for in general for the planning board, and that is I was disappointed to see what the name of this article ended up being, because a few years ago, or maybe last year, we were talking about a potential general zoning article referred to as the Great Estates zoning article, and it was going to help to protect multiple lots in town that have a great estate on them. And then this one came forward as basically more spot zoning, and I've been pretty vocal in the past that I'm not a fan of spot zoning, though I am a fan of protecting this property as much as possible. What is the plan for some of those articles that have been referred back to the planning board and that have stalled? There was a Great Estates, there was a bed and breakfast, there was non-conforming zoning, there was a couple of others.
It's I don't know if it's on our agenda for this coming meeting, but certainly in the month of March, we'll be meeting on articles that our planning staff will be bringing back to us to identify what we'll be looking at for the October meeting. I know the list includes bed and breakfast and signage based on some items that have occurred in the last couple of cycles that we may need to address. And then it's really going to be at the discretion of the board what else we look at, but the board is aware that it has work to do. It's not planning on going on vacation now that these 2 articles are done. So hopefully we'll be able to do some good work on it over the next, between now and August, when the October warrant will be done.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. All right, anything else? But if you two wouldn't mind, you want to step back and we'll invite up a couple of neighbors. And I would like to keep this reasonably brief, and I do encourage folks, if you have something lengthy and you want to submit it, do send us written communication, we'll consider it. But if a couple of folks want to come up and take 3 minutes each, I can understand your desire to do so.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. My name's Ted Phillips. I live at 28 Hemlock Drive.
Hi, Ted.
I'm just off the map, so I can't even point you out or point myself out. And I am treasurer of the Blue Hills Neighborhood Association. We have been very involved in meetings for over the last year. Many of our recommendations and requests have been incorporated in the zoning amendment. Northland's been very receptive to most of them and many of them. And it's been a good process, and we've progressed towards something we like. There are many positive aspects. Our big thing, obviously, are the number of units. We have consistently been pushing for fewer units. Our big concerns are the preservation of the character of the property, and specifically the viewscapes from Canton Avenue, which we've talked about, as well as the viewscape from Walcott Trail. You asked earlier if that was a trail from the side. Yes, it is. It's a fairly main trail as far as people walking. Unfortunately, I had some surgery this summer and was not allowed to do anything but walk. I couldn't pick anything up. I couldn't do anything else, so I was out there every day. I am absolutely 100% sure that each and every person I stopped and talked to, which were in the hundreds, were very dismayed to hear that there would be a development of townhouses just off that trail at that location, because that's where you really step into the beauty of the Blue Hills. You've come off the road up to the observatory, you're in the woods. In the future, you will be in the backyard of some of these townhouses for a while. We are concerned over the density of the development. Again, as to the impact of the character of the neighborhood, we are concerned as to the impact on traffic. There's been a little bit of a traffic study done that will tell us that it's not as bad as if it were 22 units of full families going in and out to soccer practice, and the age restriction, it would be better than that. But Canton Avenue backs up every night well beyond this property, and people sit there for quite some time. It takes me some nights 45 minutes to get from my house on Hemlock down to the light by the highway. This will just add to that. And we are very concerned also just to the impact to the topography and the trees and everything else that's there, and again, to the nature and the character of the site. I think that's probably my 3 minutes.
Thank you. Very close.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Which houses do you want to get rid of?
Yes, fair enough.
Didn't you see the map with the X's?
Yeah, I have one with X. So, Walcott Trail, there are 4 units, 2 buildings to the far right, upper right-hand corner.
Yeah.
Those would be highly visible from that trail. Yeah, buildings 18 and 17. Then we would also like to see a reduction of the units. Thank you. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, closest to Canton Avenue. Building 1 is where the third house to be maintained would be. That can be, I believe, the talk is to make that into 2 units, and that can stay, obviously, because you're not going to move, a 4,000 square foot house. But we'd be looking to reduce those units, again, closest to Canton Avenue. That's going to be a real change in viewscape from Canton Avenue as you look up through the 250 feet, which really is not very far. You're going to see a wall of house back there, that's 8 units. The distance between those houses are 20, 25 feet maybe, I don't know. And it's going to just look like a massive, I don't know, 600-700 foot wall. That's too big.
Okay,
You get my idea. 110.
Well, if I could walk around the property, I would go there, but without getting arrested.
Yeah. The stakes are still there. if you do, you can walk along the road and look back, you can see stakes out at 250 to give you an idea of exactly how far that is. There are also stakes at 75 feet. 75 feet is an amazingly small amount of room. When you look at it in this context, you can see the stakes at 250. If you look up the Casey Farm Meadow today, right as at the top of the hill in full view will be buildings there. So while it is set quite a ways back, I think we're at 350 some odd feet or more, you're going to be able to see those at the top of the house. The original plan had even more houses. When we did the site walk and there was a balloon test and stuff.
Great, thanks, Ted.
Yep.
Anybody else? Before I bring you up, Ned, is there anybody else from the Blue Hill Neighborhood Association or any other abutters that wanted to come up? Yeah. Again, if you could keep it brief, I'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My name's Tony Cicchello. I'm here tonight as an attorney for Jack Weeks, who's one of the neighbors. He's on the bottom of Carberry Road, right next to the property. So if you're coming up the hill, he's on Carberry Lane right before you hit the property on the corner. I just wanted to speak very briefly to note that I think that all of the neighbors are concerned about what goes on in the property and the number of units and that type of thing. And I think there's a consensus, everybody except maybe the developer would prefer nothing happen up there than is different than what's happening. But we're faced with a reality of a developer who owns a portion of the property and has the right to the rest of the property, and something substantial is going to happen up there. Working with Jack and some of the other neighbors on Carberry Road, we've been working with the developer for quite a number of months to try to ensure that this is a project that we're going to be able to minimize the impact both on the neighbors and for the town, to preserve the viewscapes and things like that. So what we have been working on is trying to both minimize those impact, aesthetic and otherwise, to deal with traffic and other impacts, and all of the impacts that will come to the neighbors in the development of the project. So Mr. Weeks and some of the other neighbors that I've been working with are supportive of the project. They'll hope that you'll move this forward. One of the things that really hasn't had any discussion tonight is there is an effort underway to try to get a development agreement in place that will provide some more detail and more specifics beyond the bylaw that hopefully we can have in place before town meeting. And that would provide some additional protections to the neighbors. If the financing or whatever comes through and the unit count is knocked down, that's terrific, and I don't think anybody's going to complain about that if it happens. I don't think that has to affect the other things that can go on between now and then to make this project, whatever goes forward, be the least impactful to the neighborhood and to provide some protection to the neighbors. So I'm not going to take any more of your time. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Saw another hand?
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Judy Lair Jacobs. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of the Blue Hills. And I have two quick comments. One is the Friends of the Blue Hills would like to request language requiring an independent archaeological assessment of the property prior to any development. As you probably know, it abuts the Blue Hills, and there's archaeological resources that have been found there, as well as across the street at Brush Hill Road, and it's also quite near Fowl Meadow, and all of those places have contained archaeological resources. The second point is in the Milton Master Plan. The Milton residents have said that they wanted walking and bicycling access to the Blue Hills. And adding 44 to 58 families with cars to this intersection would require significant traffic mitigation. And so we are requesting that Northland Development create a significant fund for foot and bicycle paths so that the residents can access the Blue Hills. The traffic would really make it very difficult to access the Blue Hills by bike or foot without some creative solutions like a foot or bicycle bridge over Route 138. So, that's our points.
Wow, that's ambitious. Did you raise the request for an independent archaeological review to the planning board?
We haven't yet.
Okay.
It has been requested.
It has been, archaeology has been mentioned at the public meetings.
Okay.
Not requested.
All right, thank you. Is there anybody else that wanted to speak? Yep. You gonna bring your sign?
I'll be very, very brief. My name's Hale Smith. I am a resident at 1632 Canton Avenue and a abutter to this property. I'm also president of the Blue Hill Neighborhood Association. Mr. Weeks' attorney is really the only person who's come before a public meeting that I know of in favor of this 58 unit development. There is strong sentiment from the neighborhood that 44 units, which is twice the underlying zoning of AA, which would allow us, as we've heard earlier, 22 units, is an appropriate number. The neighborhood association is in favor of a cluster townhouse development because it preserves more land, but we believe that the 10 units that are closest to the Wolcott Path and Canton Avenue should be eliminated. That would preserve probably over 70% of the land as open land and would preserve the character of the neighborhood better than the proposal before you. So far, the developer has committed $4.75 million to purchase 19 acres. The remaining 28 acres is under agreement. The price will depend on the number of units that are approved for this unit. Approving a 58-unit development makes it more difficult to affect a buy-down that might be possible in the future. So that's one of the reasons that I'm here before you this evening, is to ask for your support to allow the neighborhood to come together and affect a better solution for the town and the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I do have a question for you. It sounded like what you just said was that the Blue Hills Neighborhood Association is in favor of cluster zoning because you want to preserve the site. So it seems like the association has come to the determination that of the other two alternatives, having single-family lots would probably disturb the site a lot more. But doesn't the association see that there would be a trade-off in the number of units if you're going from a product that is single-family homes and has a number associated with it to age-restricted access, which probably limits the number of people that are coming and going?
You misunderstood me or I misspoke. When I said cluster, I meant the townhouse cluster that has been proposed by the developer. So we support 44 townhouses on that property, townhouses and condominiums, as the developer has shown them, just eliminating the 4 units closest to Wolcott Path and the 10 units along Canton Avenue.
Okay, thank you. Brian, and then I'll bring you up to Ned, sorry.
I'll be very brief. I just wanted to address a few things that were raised. One on the question about the archaeology. There was testimony before the board on the archaeological significance of this location. There was no specific request for a review. I'm not sure if we would have included a review in the zoning, but it may be a relevant condition to put into a special permit. I leave it to you as to whether it's appropriate for the zoning. But again, it may be something that can be brought in as a condition of development of the land. Same comment really for the bike and pedestrian paths. I think this will require a significant traffic study to evaluate the impact, and that will be peer reviewed by someone for the town. Forgot my glasses. Glad I came back up. So that would be an opportunity at that point when there is a demonstration of potential impact to include, again, a condition for bike paths and the like. I would be concerned about putting in a specific requirement into a zoning bylaw about a bike path or a sidewalk or any sort of traffic mitigation, because frankly, it may prove to be insufficient. So I think we would want to be careful to not preclude ourselves from being able to do more if that's what the traffic study warranted.
But it
So I
seems
just
like
raised that.
because there is a public process outlined and the developer has to address concerns that are raised, then that can be raised at that point.
Right, and that's my point. I think that's the right time to do it, is during the special permit, because I would just be afraid that if we tried to guess today what the mitigation might be for traffic impacts, that we might undershoot what may actually be deemed necessary.
Okay.
Thank you.
You had a question, Richard?
Quick question, yeah. I mean, high level, what is an archaeological assessment?
I don't know.
Okay. I'm going to ask my second one just in case.
I assume that it's, I think it's exactly what it sounds like,
But also,
right?
what would be the
But
outcomes?
I don't know. I would want someone to answer
Okay.
that question on my behalf. I have a general idea of what it is, but I don't want to mislead you.
Is Judy still here?
Okay.
Did she leave? Yeah.
Because if we're going to think about that, we would need to know what it is.
You have an independent.
Why don't you come back up so that the folks watching at home can hear you? So what did you mean when you referenced
my
the independent
understanding
archaeological
Is that
survey?
you have an independent expert do corings into the land,
Okay.
and then they determine whether there's resources there, whether there's something that's valuable.
And what's like a potential outcome of that? Like you can't build on it, or?
Probably.
Okay. Okay. All right.
I mean, having seen this in action in Boston, it's typically they come in, they're given an opportunity to look in some limited amount of time to recover what they can. But, I mean, Boston wouldn't be there. Any of those new developments wouldn't be there. Archaeological reviews are pretty standard in town, and it's an opportunity to look, and then
Okay, thank you.
they keep going.
Find your arrowhead.
Yeah, no, typically not.
Ned, do you want to come back up?
Yeah, just,
Respond to a couple of points?
just a couple of things. One is, I know that this committee is extremely busy and works extremely hard, but if the committee thought that between now and town meeting, it would be appropriate to have a site walk, to get out and see the property, that's something that we could accommodate, either in an evening or on a Saturday morning, as the committee does. We've had 2 or 3 planning board, selectmen, and others over the course of last year. We'd certainly be happy to host this committee and others who could join as well. It's really, it's got, you need to, I think you need to see it, because, and the other thing is that I would just leave, I think the planning board's outcome of 58 units was its effort to balance alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And any adjustment from 58, as I said, results in a completely different project, because there will be no application for a special permit filed under zoning that reduces the unit count that would be available to the developer. And so I think you need to, you just need to really balance that. It'll be a completely different project.
Yes, Richard?
The alternative, what would an alternative be?
A lot more units under the state's Comprehensive Permit Act. It would be a 40B development.
How many, what can you fit on there?
A lot.
Yeah.
We've looked at plans with 125 plus. So a standard subdivision blows up the land, a 40B blows up the land. The alternative is more than people would like to see. It's less than what the developer sought to do, but it's an outcome that we think works for the property and it works for the town.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have something that they want to share? All right. Oh, okay. One last one.
Dr. Barry Woods at Carberry Lane.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this evening, and I could have, for a couple of minutes, remind us all that 400 years ago, plague hit Milton. 400 to 4,500 Native Americans died on this property in the Blue Hills. It's the last and the longest undeveloped property in Milton since 1720 by the Walcott family. In 1750, there was an extension to one of the homes there. But when we consider the fact that for 10,000 years before that, there was a vibrant civilization of Native Americans there, that Thomas Morton described in his first visit as a settler in 1602, what he found there, the cultivated land, Indian corn, and farming. And two major tracks that were one was to the Neponset River via the property we live on, Carberry Lane, and a stream comes right through that property, which can be quite devastating in the rain season or in the snow melting. We get a lot of water in our basements. We need to consider the fact that a lot of the trees that are up on that property is protective, the roots, etc. But when you raise the water level and you move 300,000 square feet of property or of land and loam, it's going to change that. So we may expect some more flooding. The last big flood was 1904, and after that, Coolidge recommended that there be 8 dams placed in the Blue Hills, and that one dam is right on this property, right close to my home. Besides that, the fact is the density of the traffic, and what most people, as I observe, after 4 o'clock any day of the week, people empty their trash from their cars, literally onto the sidewalks, or the side of the road. So we have a lot of trash there at weekends. A lot of, and the traffic and the trash and the density is going to be a major problem. So I think that's something to consider. Now, as regards the archaeological approach, the Eustis Estate were mandated by the DCR to have an archaeological survey to put in their recent sewerage. That property was developed in 1825. 100 years before that, we're talking about Walcott property. Significant artifacts have been found in the Wakefield Estate across the street. Rush Hill Road and Canton Ave are the two longest, the oldest roads in Milton. And the natives used Rush Hill to get down to the Neponset River. So that there's been wonderful finds of archaeological items on that Wakefield property, and it's literally a stone's throw from what we're speaking about. So I think it's apparently there is a recommendation if a historic site borders DCR, that the DCR mandates an archaeological survey. I think it's happened at the poultry farm and other projects in town. From where we live down to the Unquity Road was known as Indian Town. The last survivor died in 1928. Mingo was her name. We have Mingo Road off Canton Avenue in that area. So there's there were 5 burial grounds found off Robin Street in 1898 by Professor Teal, Milton historian. There's a part of the graveyard in Milton Cemetery that looks out for the remains of Native Indians, Americans, that have been found on Indian cliffs during that development back in the 70s. I think it's the least we might do to recognize what those people suffered, the forgotten people of Milton 400 years ago this month. Thank you very
for
much.
sharing that history with us. All right, I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute recess before we come back and discuss the Town Government Study Committee articles. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
Huh? No.
for the brief break. We will pick up conversation on those two articles on Wednesday. And we are joined at the table by two members, three if you count Phil, of the Town Government Study Committee. And, what'd you say?
Said I count you, Phil.
Thanks.
Welcome. Do you guys want to give us a brief overview of how
First
the
of all, let me
CPO
introduce myself. My
article
name is Rick Neely.
Sure.
I'm the chairman of the Town Government Study Committee. Peter Mullen here. And we also have two members behind me, which is John Cronin and Kathy Fagan, who are also members of the Town Government Study Committee here with us, along with Phil. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start off by saying that we appreciate the opportunity to come in and speak to you about the chief procurement article. And the genesis of this is that you recall that there was a town school consolidation committee that started in 2014, and I believe you should all have a copy of that report electronically. And this was the beginning of how we began to look at this chief procurement officer. So on that committee at the time was a broad representation between the town and the schools. So Mike Zulis at the time was a member of the school committee and served on that committee, along with Glenn Pavlicek, who's here tonight, the assistant superintendent of schools. We also had the town treasurer on that committee. Phil was on that committee. We had the town accountant, Amy Dexter, and we also had the town administrator at that time, Anne Marie Fagan, on the committee. And they made a recommendation back on February 4th, 2016, after they studied this for some 15 or 18 months, to recommend that it be a chief procurement officer. And the key reasons were compliance with the Mass General Laws, Chapter 30B, and that drives the behavior of every city and town along with state agencies. They also reported that it would make sense from a centralized purchasing to find the best prices. They thought it would result in time savings for town departments. They believed there would be savings on the external legal costs where departments use the outside counsel for preparing RFPs and requests for bids. And so they asked us to look at that in the context of our reviews of the town financial system. And our committee actually felt that it was important enough to separate that out from the review of the overall financial system. So we have yet to finish that project, but we think this is important enough to get before you, because it's important for the town to be in compliance with the law. I mean, that's a key driver here, is that right now, everything is fragmented, it's decentralized. We believe this bylaw is needed to get this in compliance with the state law. And we have recommended that there be a part-time position initially to get this thing off and running. But regardless of that, we believe that a bylaw is needed, whether the position is funded or not. So let me ask Peter Mullen, who was the really head of the group. He's our working group person on this one, and Peter did a lot of extensive work on that. And coincidentally, happens to be the chairman of the bylaw committee that's reviewing all of the bylaws in the town.
We had a lot of discussions within the committee. We did a lot of reaching out. I think we interviewed a total of 12 department heads within the town, in addition to the then town manager, town administrator, Anne Marie Fagan, and we've talked with the current town administrator. I think there's been some questions have been raised about why is this a bylaw? And why are you creating this position by means of a bylaw? It's kind of in response to things that we learned during the course of the investigation. Sometimes our town has a very decentralized purchasing right now. Every department does its own purchasing. There is no center of expertise per se within the structure of town government with regard to purchasing, either 30B requirements or with finding the best prices. And in addition to the Town School Consolidation Committee recommending that we adopt a chief procurement officer, the outside audit firm that does our annual audit, Sullivan and Powers, they have, the last several years, they've recommended in the management letter that the town create a position of a chief procurement officer. The reason we're proposing to do this through a bylaw is so that the authority of the chief procurement officer will be clearly stated, and that the chief procurement officer will have something to point to as the basis on which the chief procurement officer can kind of centralize and pull together the procurement process. We have a very decentralized government with lots of independently elected boards and committees, and they may well be resistant to the kind of centralization of procurement. And we think it's important that the chief procurement officer have some document to be able to point to and say, this is the authority that the town meeting has given to the chief procurement officer. This is in terms of being able to get information from them about prospective purchases, and also to see the purchases. I think everybody has received a copy of the proposed article. Does anybody need a copy of the article? There's a couple of things I guess I would point out. Paragraph 1 says that the town administrator would appoint the chief procurement officer. That's actually one of the powers we gave the town administrator in the Strong Town Administrator Special Legislative Act that's been passed by town meeting and then by the legislature. Paragraph 2 requires that this chief procurement officer be certified by the Inspector General's office as a Massachusetts public procurement person. That's a series of courses that you have to take to get certified. We think it's important that the person be certified. It may be that the person who initially has the position isn't, but they would have to get certified over a 3-year period. Paragraph 3 lays out kind of the powers or the authority of the chief procurement officer. The person would serve as the head of the department, and it says that no town employee, department, board, or committee shall expend $5,000 or more of town money, except with a purchase order that was issued with the approval of the CPO. We think that's a basic power that the CPO needs in order to have all town procurement to go through the CPO. A question was raised during the course of developing this recommendation about, well, what's the scope of that review? And the CPO shouldn't be able to say, you don't need that textbook, or you don't need that fire truck. And so that there's a sentence in the middle of that paragraph that says the CPO's review and approval of purchase orders shall be limited to compliance with procurement laws and regulations, and whether there are opportunities for cost savings, and shall not include whether the proposed purchase is needed. And we think that's the appropriate scope of the review that the CPO should be doing. Paragraph 4 talks about the CPO being a resource and an advisor available to departments. Departments are still going to be recognizing their needs. They're the people that know the most about the kind of things they're buying. What the CPO would add would be purchasing expertise. In paragraph 5, we tasked the CPO with the duty and responsibility to maintain records necessary to show that we're in compliance with state purchasing laws. And paragraph 6 provides an appeal process should the CPO disapprove either a purchase order or an invitation for bids or a request for proposal. It provides an appeal process either to the town administrator or to the superintendent of schools. It specifically exempts the school committee and the Board of Selectmen from that requirement. They very infrequently would be issuing a purchase order or an invitation for bids, but it's conceivable that they would, and it just doesn't seem structurally right that people who appoint them who appoint the superintendent of schools or the town administrator should be subject to disapproval. that they should be above that. We also, when we drafted this article, we went back and forth with regard to whether this should be a full-time position or a part-time position. The School-Town Consolidation Committee recommended a part-time position. It's very hard to get a sense as to how much time is going to be needed to do these things. We decided to go with a part-time position in part because of financial considerations and that the financial year that we're in. We drafted this in the hope that you would recommend this be part of the non-contingent budget. We think that this position will actually save money in town government. Right now, when people have questions with regard to procurement issues, whether drafting invitations for bids or requests for proposals, historically what we've frequently done is use town council's firm for advice and review and comment on proposed invitations for bids and requests for proposals. In fiscal year 2016, we spent almost $26,000 on review by the law firm limited to procurement matters. We think with a certified public purchasing official in the town that we can substantially reduce that expenditure. We think that we can also save money with regard to our purchasing through identifying, other cooperatives, things where we can consolidate purchases, things where we can get a better price. So we would urge that the position be funded through the non-contingent budget.
In order to fund the position through the non-contingent budget, at this point, we would have to cut $40,000 from somewhere, which might very well mean cutting another position in town somewhere. Do you have any recommendation as to where you'd like that money to come out of?
I do not. I guess we didn't feel that we were in the position in the committee to make a recommendation in that regard. I think we could say that it wouldn't necessarily have to be the elimination of some position, some other person. I realize that there would have to be a cut totaling whatever appropriation was appropriated. But $40,000 might be found through the savings that's going to happen in various departments. Bill Ritchie from Consolidated Facilities, he told the School-Town Consolidation Committee that he estimated that he spent 100 hours a year at least on procurement matters and drafting invitations for bids. John Thompson in the DPW spends a large amount of time on drafting invitations for bids with regard to things like paving contracts and buying sand and salt and all kinds of things. So that it may be within the budgets of various departments, there is money that can be taken that presumably some people within those departments will be freed up a little bit by the creation of that position.
Brian and then Maggie.
I'm struggling with this notion of cost savings, that a generic part-time procurement, someone with procurement expertise is going to generate cost savings across the wide spectrum of functions and disciplines in this town, more so than the institutional experts across the different departments. I'm struggling with how we quantify that, and also the way this is worded, where it starts off saying making sure we're within compliance, but then also cost savings. Those are two very different things. Because let me back off that second part. I'm really struggling with seeing how this part-time procurement expert is going to generate more cost savings than the functional experts across the town departments.
the people in the town departments are very familiar with the things they buy.
Right.
And in the calls that I had with them, the vast majority of them say, you know, I usually buy something from the X company, you know, the mailing of the treasury bills, or, you know, the purchasing of grass seed or hydroseeding by the park department. I mean, they have a routine. We did it this way last year. We generally go back to the same people the next year. The thing that the CPO would bring would be knowledge of other alternatives. The school department purchases almost all of its supplies, its office supplies and things of that nature, through something called the Tech Cooperative, which is an association of 10 or 12 towns in or cities and towns in the greater Boston area. In talking with Assistant Superintendent Pavlicek, I mean, he told me, you know, I can't be sure that I'm getting the best price on all these things. What it provides me is it's convenient because the cooperative has complied with the bidding laws and put it out to bid, and therefore I can know I'm in compliance with the law when I buy through the cooperative. Many times there are bidders who are unsuccessful on getting the cooperative contract, and they'll come back to cities and towns and actually offer a better price because they're kind of cut off from that other volume of work that the cooperatives provide.
So just to follow up on that, I think what I'm struggling with is that in this one silo, they're gonna possess the requisite expertise to give you the best deal on fertilizer for the town and social studies textbooks.
Right.
I find that hard to believe that in this one person is gonna be that authority across these disciplines.
Jack of all trades.
There is an association of public procurement officials within the Commonwealth. And so that there's a resource out there. You know, I expect that it's going to be a progressive thing for the CPO, and that, you know, you're not going to find the best price for everything in the first year, and that you're probably going to pick out a few things each year. We have 5 or 6 departments that purchase vehicles, and it may be that you focus on vehicles. You talk to the purchasing officials in other towns through the association. There are multiple buying cooperatives, and you may get information about where you can get a better price or what the current best price is. So that I don't think everything will get the best price in the first year.
Just to add to that, I mean, I think the example of textbooks is an interesting example, because textbooks and science supplies, and that's an expert, if you will, within the department.
I was just using it
And
to
so-
describe two
More
disparate
generic-
disciplines more
More
than anything.
generic products that cross the line. I mean, if the school department is buying sand and the park department is buying sand, the DPW is buying sand, it's very unclear that, A, we're complying with state bidding laws. I mean, the number one goal of this bylaw is to ensure that we are in compliance. There's no effort right now to determine we're in compliance with the state law. So it's easier to promise compliance with the state and local laws than it is to say you're going to save X amount of dollars. And given that, we're still going to focus on the broad areas, and certainly the department head in charge of the science department is going to be the person choosing the chemical supplies, and this person is not going to focus on chemical supplies in the school department.
I have Maggie, and then Jonathan, and then Richard.
Just 2 points is, because you said you have, like, Mr. Thompson's hundreds of hours, so they're specialized and they know what they're purchasing. So they're going to be working with the chief procurement officer, because he's not going to know about the specialized items, if I heard you right. They'll still be working, I think, together somewhat.
Right, they definitely will be working together. The CPO will have expertise with regard to
The
bidding
paperwork,
and drawing up that. Part of, if you do issue bids, then one of the big issues is, where do you advertise your bid? Are there trade associations? Are there places where you can reach bidders who haven't been considering your work in the past?
The Dodge
That's the
report.
expertise that they would add.
But then my second follow-up is, I'm having a difficult time. we're saying that we want this person, it's gonna be, a process. Why are we giving someone 3 years? Let's just get what is necessary. If someone is gonna take this position, let's get someone that is the certified public purchasing official. Why does someone have to have 3 years to learn this trade on the taxpayers' dollars? Let's just, at the get-go, get the most qualified person. I go to an accountant, a CPA, let's get the one that's a member of this with the right credentials to begin with. That's my own personal
The answer
opinion.
to that question is that would be within the authority of the town administrator. So the town administrator would have that authority. If the town administrator felt exactly like you feel, the town administrator could require that. This gives a little flexibility.
I don't like the flexibility. Anyone can get that position. Oh, we'll give you 3 years to learn it. Let's get a qualified person. Take that wording out, and let's get the person that's gonna know what they're doing at the get-go.
This is a position we're proposing a part-time position, so that you may not find someone who has that certification and necessarily wants to
Well,
take the position.
maybe we can share with another town.
That's right, but you have to find 2 towns that are convenient to this person. The other thing is that this certification is offered by the Inspector General's office. There's a limited number of courses each year, so that you may be partway through the process, but in order to take the courses and get the certification, it may take, the courses it's usually 3 or 4 courses a year.
Okay. Jonathan?
I have had some experience with state purchasing laws, not directly, but I've overseen people who've done it. And it seems to me that the real savings, at least initially, won't be savings in terms of the price you're paying, but savings in terms of the person you mentioned in DPW who spends 100 hours a year. That time's now freed up, because a lot of this really is making sure that every T is crossed and every dot is I'd. It's just complicated, and whether it makes sense or not, we're bound by the state laws. And it seems to me that the initial savings in any event aren't because we're getting fertilizer cheaper, it's because we've got people who can now do their jobs rather than spend a lot of time complying with very complicated state regs.
Richard?
Yeah, I want to go a bit about that and add. I think it is a good idea. I will say I didn't share the other concerns that I heard, just because. So I work for a very large company, and when I have RFPs, I'm the expert in my group, but I rely on the procurement officers to run me through the process, to follow those rules, and also to make sure there's many thousands of people in my company. Maybe somebody that I don't know is working on a similar bid, and they're like kind of the eyes and ears around the company. So I just wanted to make that note, because I think they provide a great service, and you still need the other folks involved because they get the expertise. But again, in most private large companies, you find procurement officers to add this other piece. My other question, and we probably wouldn't be able to answer it right now, is I'm curious. I mean, my major concern would be the money in the non-contingent budget, and even figuring out where it's going to be in the contingent. But my question is more in the, what does the schools think of this idea? What does the town think of this idea? Do we know that?
I don't have any.
Well, first of all, we've been working closely with the town and the schools, and they wrote the first report that was the basis for us to adopt this recommendation.
The consolidation committee.
Right, so you had a member of the school committee. We had a member of the school committee on our committee. Leroy Walker is a member who's not here tonight. So the schools have been participating, and Peter has been, talking to Glenn throughout the whole process. So there has been, I think, a very coordinated effort. Peter and myself spoke with Mike Dennehy on the phone, and obviously Peter's been talking, I think, 11 department heads?
Yes, 12.
12 department heads. So there has been an effort to try to be as inclusive as possible. So that's been the effort. So in the article, it's co-sponsored with the Board of Selectmen, and I believe the chairperson of the Board of Selectmen.
It looks like Katie's getting ready to join us. Selectwoman Conlon, do you want to weigh in a little bit on that question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Warrant Committee and the Town Government Study Committee. We saw an earlier draft of this. We did provide some questions and comments, very minor ones. we actually have it on our agenda tomorrow night to have a discussion about the latest draft, but I did want to just bring to your attention, and as we've notified the Town Government Study Committee, the town administrator and the town accountant have questioned whether this should be a full-time or a part-time position. They are of the inclination that if the CPO would address both the school and the non-school, or the town purchasing, that there's probably a need for it to be a full-time position. That was an early comment that came from them. We haven't really discussed that as a board, but I wanted to just bring that to your attention. That, and obviously, we all know how the non-contingent budget is, so that may be difficult in and of itself. And there's a suggestion to at least begin with a part-time position may make some sense. We just haven't had a further conversation about that since the initial draft we saw in January. And at that time, we did not have a dollar amount associated with it. So we'll take that up tomorrow night.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think Steve had a question. Was it for Katie?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
Nope.
Steve and then
A
Maggie.
comment and then a question. And I'm somebody that's done hundreds of procurements on the state system over the years, and the rules change. A department may do a procurement one year and not do another one for a couple, and you can waste an awful lot of time when somebody doesn't know what the process steps are. It's very difficult to tease out savings. But they're real in terms of, having somebody with the expertise in 30B to be able to keep you, what's your, guardrails? Keep you inside the guardrails, but in terms of being able to document what the savings are, it's difficult to do. My question, completely kind of changing, whenever I see one of these, there's a requirement, I wonder what the hammer is. So if a town department decides it's going to opt itself out of this, what hammer is there to require them to do so?
I think it's the last sentence of paragraph 3 that says that the accountant's not going to pay any bill they submit unless there's an approved purchase order.
By the CPO.
Right, that it's been approved by the CPO.
Sounds like a hammer.
That was the intent.
Maggie?
No, I agree, Steve. I think the whole general idea is great. I think this is a necessary position, but I still can't wrap myself around not getting the right person for the job at the beginning. And what happens after 3 years of appointment if they don't maintain the certification? Do we just extend it? Do we just forget it? Who's in charge of following through? Now, our town manager that recently retired had to take, over 5 years ago, 3 college credit courses, which she never did. No one followed through on that. I'm just saying, I don't want this to be the same situation. I think we need to get the right people to do the job and not put these things in here that say, oh, you're going to follow through. No one's checking to make sure people follow through with what they're supposed to do. That's just my own personal opinion.
Well, in this case, it would be the responsibility of the town administrator to enforce that.
And who was the responsibility prior to make sure the town administrator previous took 3 college credits that was required?
You're about to meet the person responsible.
Yeah, I have to respond to that. The former town administrator had conversations with the board, and a prior board had put that requirement upon her. Subsequent board said that she was working well beyond 40 hours a week. She was working weekends, she was working nights, she was at meetings every night. There was just no practical way for her to fulfill
And why put in
taking
laws
additional courses
that you can't do?
that a prior board had suggested. So a subsequent board relieved her of that responsibility and suggested that it was more important that she be in the office and that she be working on town business rather than taking a couple of extra classes.
Thank you.
Why
I
put
just
that in a
wanted to address
contract
that.
then, if they're not going to fulfill it? You take a job like that, you understand you're going to be doing more than 40 hours.
Maggie, I think we get your point.
Unfortunately, there were a lot of vacancies in the office, and she was doing more than one full-time job, so that was the circumstance in that particular case.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I did not find any errors that I could correct.
Oh, my God. Woo!
That's because we have the chairman of the bylaw committee. The chairman of the bylaw committee, Attorney Peter Mullen.
But I do have a question for you, and that is the consistent use of purchase order language. And I just wanted to ask if you sussed out any potential unintended consequences of the town eventually going to a system that doesn't use purchase orders or uses something that's called something different. And I wonder, it didn't even seem necessary to me to keep all the references in there to purchase orders. You could just say approval. Did you talk about that, and are you concerned about that at all?
In the course of the investigation, we did learn that the town has purchased this new SoftWrite software package with regard to financial things. I think payroll has now incorporated on that. I think the town is in the process of adopting electronic purchase orders. I mean, it's kind of a functional term that, before you buy something, you get that purchase approved. You identify the vendor, the thing that's being purchased, and the amount. The other thing that the outside accountants have raised is that in our current accounting system, we don't encumber money until the invoice is received in the town accountant's office. And if you have an in-place comprehensive purchase order system, then you can encumber the money at the point you are obligating yourself to make the purchase.
So I think the use of a purchase order system is standard in both industry as well as government, and certainly we've been behind the times. We've been, as Peter said, cited by the auditors for not having. So I don't believe the use of the word purchase order is going to go away in the next 5 or 10 years. Maybe it'll go away someday in the future. But
Okay.
purchase order is a generally accepted term.
I agree that it is. All right, and then I believe that Dr. Pavlicek would like to approach the table.
Just to say, the school uses purchase orders. We do encumber money as we make purchases, and then then unencumber the money and pay it. We've been
Yeah.
using a purchase order system for a number of years. It is paper, but we enter it into the town
I wasn't
accounting system.
accusing anybody of not using it.
I just-
I was pointing out the long-term implications of our process may be changing and our terminology changing and using, purchase order comes from the days of carbon copy papers, right? So are we still going to keep calling that?
That's what he used.
I could point out that the $5,000 limit might probably change too.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pell.
I do want to say, I just want to make sure everybody understands that even if the position gets caught up in this funding issue of contingent and non-contingent.
It's about to.
We still, even if it does, we still would request the recommendation in support of the Chapter 24, even if the position itself is not funded, because we need the authority. And there will be a chief procurement officer within the town, regardless of whether you approve this position or not. And the authority is needed to transcend all of the decentralized, independent boards.
Okay.
One more question.
Michael?
Have you looked at the other neighboring towns to see, is it a full-time position in our comparable towns, or is it?
It's a mixture. It's a real mixture.
It's a mix. Surprisingly, Stoughton seems to have, it has a full-time position. It seems to have the most fully developed program. The woman that's the chief procurement officer there is an instructor in a lot of the Inspector General's classes. Needham and Lexington also have, they have full-time purchasing officials. And then, we didn't look at cities. Very large towns and cities, they virtually all have purchasing officials.
I can't remember if I saw a hand over here or not. Yeah, Jonathan,
quick
and
question.
then Richard.
Actually,
Just yes or no.
You're good?
Would this, since it's being established by bylaw, presumably this is not a personnel board matter?
No, it's, we'll go through the personnel process. So the personnel board has the authority to approve the creation of new positions, and the intention is to have this go through that same
I
process.
was just wondering whether the bylaw.
We don't see the bylaw superseding that.
Okay, thank you.
They have that authority, and we comply with that.
Very good.
Maggie?
Is the chief procurement officer now our new strong town administrator? Does that come under his?
Yes.
If a town is going to issue a request for proposals, then state law requires that there be a CPO for the town. So the current town administrator, he got a letter from the Inspector General's office saying, who's Milton's CPO, and he designated himself as the CPO. But, that doesn't seem like responsibilities that he should be doing on a day-to-day basis.
I just want to, on that point, let Chairwoman Conlon know that I had let you know that I was concerned that there wasn't a provision in here for if the position was vacant. And I did approach the Town Government Study Committee and point that out to them. And they pointed out to me that because the Strong Town Administrator article, language includes the ability for the town administrator to appoint somebody as the CPO. In the event that the position is vacant, these things won't go undone. The TA would likely appoint themselves to do it or somebody else to do it while the position was vacant. So that's no longer a concern of mine. Just informally, who here is open to having a conversation about further reductions in the non-contingent budget in order to fund a procurement officer to the tune of $40,000?
Can I ask another question that might help us come to this decision? You mentioned that
Sure.
you spent $26,000 asking the legal questions about procurement. So does that mean that if I'm the DPW department and I call the lawyer and ask him a question, that money comes out of my budget, or that's coming out of the law budget?
I believe it came out of the law budget. And it may not be calling about, a question you have. It might be a question, or it might also just be drawing up the invitation for bids, the request for proposals. There's a lot of boilerplate language and things that go into that. So that I don't think you totally eliminate calls to the lawyer on procurement issues or questions. But
They
I think
cut
you
down on
greatly
them somehow.
reduce it.
Yeah, okay.
Richard?
So does that mean we can cut the law budget by 26,000?
No. No, it doesn't. No, because
You
it
gotta
does.
cut somebody's, so-
It doesn't mean that all the questions would go away. Because to the point earlier, you're not going to hire somebody who's an expert on all of these things, and you're still going to have issues that need to go to town attorney, to town council for opinion.
Gotta find 40 grand somewhere.
Do we have time
But
to
procuring
digest?
pencils is a lot
Yeah.
easier than procuring, the construction services and construction
right.
contract for, all the pieces that go into that stuff. It's off the charts, so.
Do we have time to think about it? Because, and wait until it goes, I think Katie mentioned, our chairwoman, that this isn't the final draft?
This article is the final
it?
draft.
Oh, that she hasn't presented it yet. is
She hasn't
that correct?
presented to her.
You're going to
Okay.
discuss this current version at the Board of Selectmen tomorrow
But
night.
this is the final draft, and
So I'm assuming they're going to approve
Chair
it.
Conlon, can I ask you a question? Would you mind coming back to the table? Is this the same situation as with the planning board articles where the board is going to reopen the warrant and insert this language on the warrant?
Not for this one, because this is the recommendation. The article has stayed the same.
Okay, so then I am wondering, this is a suggested recommendation from the Town Government Study Committee. I am wondering about the possibility of striking this language at the end, approving the article without any reference to the funding, and then having a discussion about the Board of Selectmen budget, where I would assume this position would go, and possibly including either a $40,000 contingent request on that line at the town administrator could come back and say, yes, I want to prioritize this in my tier 1 and tier 2, and we could reconsider that. And we can go back to the non-contingent budget and open up again if folks are interested in doing that and making cuts somewhere else. But I don't think it needs to be in this article, especially because I don't know how to write the article for contingent, non-contingent scenarios, and I'd prefer to avoid that. I'd rather just have the article establish the position and the priorities that the CPO will have, and then deal with the funding through the budget process.
Well, so the article asks, among other things, to see what sum the town will appropriate for this purpose. So I think if you were going to take that strategy, rather than just deleting it, you'd at least say further recommended that no appropriation be made.
Okay.
Or you could do, in the non-contingent budget, it'd be 0 and be 40 in the contingent budget, if you were so inclined to do that. So there are a couple of alternative ways to handle it, but if you wanted to say no appropriation and handle it under a departmental budget article, you probably should say specifically say no appropriation be made under this article.
Yeah, I think if
Or
you...
even the comment, you could.
If you include an appropriation in the selectmen's budget, either contingent or non-contingent, then I think you can just delete it is further recommended language. It just won't need to be there.
But Chair Conlon is pointing out that the article itself asks,
To save some money.
Right, and that's the scope of the article. That was one of the things we included in the article that we submitted, as, an appropriation. But the fact that the recommendation doesn't address an appropriation won't be a problem. It's narrower rather than broader than the article.
I'm inclined to agree with that because I don't want to confuse people by saying no recommendation, that we recommend no appropriation at this time. I know we could explain it in the comment, but I'd rather the comment just said, with respect to the funding, please see the Board of Selectmen budget.
It's fine.
Makes more sense,
I would suggest striking this then. Does anybody have a concern about that on the committee? And we need to come back to that. I will raise it to the town administrator to relook at the priorities, because he did prepare 3 tiers of priorities for us, and the CPO funding was not in those 3 tiers. So I'd like him to reconsider where he wants that in the contingent budget, and we can keep talking about whether or not we want to find room in the non-contingent. Yes, Richard?
About that last comment.
Yes.
If you're asking the town administrator about the contingent budget, I mean, for me, I don't know where I would cut it, so wouldn't it be appropriate to ask the town administrator where he would see cutting 40 extra grand?
For the non-contingent?
Yeah.
We could ask him that, yes. Maybe he'll recommend we cut it from the schools. So.
I'm not advocating, well, that's my point, I'm not advocating to beat Glenn up anymore. He's got to, if that's going to go on their side, they're going to have to find 40 grand to cut it.
Yeah, I'm
Just
being
my
facetious.
opinion.
I don't imagine that the strong town administrator would recommend cutting the money from the schools. But the point that I was trying to make is, I think we just went through a difficult discussion about where we make $1.5 million of cuts, and I personally am not, excited to open up that wound again. I am interested in this article, and I think the position is interesting. It would probably benefit the town in untold ways. I think that fiscal year 18 non-contingent is not the time to do the funding of it. I think contingent, if we're going to have a contingent budget for next year, is the time to try to address it. But as you said, either way, you're interested in us helping to create the position and recommending that town meeting create the position. And create the bylaw. It sounds like people are generally in favor of that. I'm wondering if somebody wants to make a recommendation wants to make a motion on the recommended recommendation that's on the screen.
I move that we approve the amended recommendation, the amended article is presented on the screen.
Thanks, Lucinda. Should beat you to it. Any discussion?
I like that idea.
All those in favor? Is that a yes, Maggie?
Yeah.
All those opposed? One opposed and the rest in favor. Any abstaining? No. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank
so
you.
we'll take up a conversation with the TA about the funding.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were very convincing on the subject.
Of what?
You were very convincing on the subject of procurement officer.
Every big company has one. We have a big,
Yes,
we
I
have
did.
like 4 people in our company.
Yeah, I think you
For
told
like many thousands.
This is just approve the position.
I surely know what
I don't know how I would do that.
Okay. It's later than I hoped it would be when we got to this point in the agenda.
Right, right.
I could never know if somebody else is looking for the same thing somewhere else.
I am going to pull up the schedule.
Specs.
We're coming back on Wednesday to vote on some zoning.
We're coming back on Wednesday. We need to retake up the 2 zoning articles. We're going to have the Board of Selectmen here to present the rest of their articles, and then we're going to get a presentation from the Capital Improvement Planning Committee. So we do have a full night that night, but Monday, so we probably won't have a lot of time to discuss the contingent, non-contingent budget was what I was trying to say there. But we do have a full night right now on the 13th. to discuss the contingent, non-contingent budget and the Blue Hills presentation. I don't expect the Blue Hills presentation to be much longer than 30 minutes. I can probably hold them to that amount of time. So that gives us a lot of time to work through the contingent budget that evening. And then I had been holding the 15th for the budget rep meeting to present back the budget. That doesn't mean we can't have any deliberations that night or make some votes if it took that amount of time. So I'm not very concerned that where we are, and I don't think we need to spend too much time talking tonight, but I do want to get the feeling. I asked folks to sleep on the 3 tiers that we received from both the town administrator and from the schools, and I'd just like to know what reaction you've had and try to keep the conversation moving along rather than just continuing to put it on hold. So if we can spend a few minutes talking about that, I'd love to hear any thoughts people have.
Do you want to put it up so we can show it? I've got so many schedules now, I'm not sure what I'm looking at.
In summary, I just put up here that we have a shortfall of $1.5 million. The town administrator suggested for town departments, excluding the schools, a tier 1 of $1,007,999, and you see tier 2 and tier 3 here. That if all 3 tiers combined is $1.7 million. The schools recommended a tier 1 of $1.1 million, and you see here they're tier 2 and tier 3, and a subtotal for what all 3 tiers would be, $1.895 million. For the heck of it, I just created a subtotal to show what both tier 1s together, plus the shortfall, plus the allowance for the creation of new positions under Tier 1. We only have that information for Tier 1. I don't have it for Tier 2 and 3, so I couldn't do that for you. But yes, Jonathan?
We heard from the Board of Selectmen last time that their number was more like 3.4, and I wondered if we're any, because that's a big difference, $500,000, and I wondered where we're going. Has there been any progress on that?
We're meeting tomorrow night.
Okay, you haven't, yes, okay, thank you.
Yes, Richard?
I was just going to ask, in thinking about, like, when you talk about what the pulse of the room is,
yeah.
Is there anybody that's thinking we're going past tier 1?
I'm wondering if there are things in Tier 2 or Tier 3 that you want to pull up. Not necessarily take the whole Tier 2, but I'm wondering if folks looked at the list and said something on Tier 2 really belongs higher up on the list, something on Tier 1 doesn't belong, or something was missed. We don't just have to give a check mark to the schools and the town administrators' recommendations for Tier 1s, right?
Right.
And
I was just trying to find one of those guardrails.
Sure.
I wasn't advocating for all of tier.
Okay. Let's ask that question then, if you want to, about guardrails. Yeah, Mike?
So I heard from Amy Dexter at the end of our last meeting that they're thinking of bonding the roads because our $150,000 for roads is completely inadequate. And I saw the capital budget, it was $1 million that they were going to put aside, which is, so I'm wondering if we're going to bond $1 million for the roads, if we need to keep 100,000 on this tier 1. Maybe there's some room for a procurement officer in there.
Yeah, another.
Roads is 100,000, it's 100,000 on tier 1.
No, there's more on.
150
50.
and 2, yeah.
Or 150. Yeah, 150 on tier 2.
I have a question for Katie on this. There's also an article that we're going to be discussing on Wednesday night with the Board of Selectmen to create a stabilization fund for roadways. What is the thought process on how that would get funded? I know it's a question more for Tom, but...
Yeah, I was going to say, that's really one that he's been doing the work on for our committee with town council, so I can bring it up tomorrow night. When you say how would it be funded, I know that the thinking was it would be funded through an override, so that it would become, through the contingent budget, so that it would become an ongoing thing year to year.
Yeah, that's my concern, Michael, is that there needs to be some number in the contingent budget that isn't bonded, because otherwise there's not a continuous input of money into the new roadway stabilization fund.
So that's where that's going to go.
Yeah. What about the other item, the snow removal we discussed? Have we done anything
Katie made a note
about
on that, and I think you were going to discuss that.
Yes, and again, we'll have to take
Yep.
that up tomorrow
Yeah.
night. That's,
Sure.
we just haven't had a meeting since the
Yep.
last time.
Thanks,
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
So back to Richard's question about the guardrails. How are people feeling about the two tier ones combined plus the ancillary costs, bringing the total to 3.8 million? Do you have an appetite for adding to that number, or is that already past your guardrail and you're thinking we need to bring it down a little bit or a lot of it? Or do you not even want a contingent budget? I mean, this is not a foregone conclusion. Yes, Maggie.
Tier 2 under the fire, the new equipment, it's not a very big item. Oh, wait a second. It's small money, but, you know, the fire department, their equipment is ancient.
I think that is a general increase to their new equipment line. He was looking to bump it up a little bit in the future. But the Capital Improvement Planning Committee request that we're going to be reviewing on Wednesday night includes substantial upgrades to that equipment he was talking about in terms of the emergency response and whatnot. So you'll see there are large dollar numbers included here for the fire department to upgrade that equipment that he was referencing. Fire station communications equipment, $60,000. Yes, Richard.
Well, actually, I mean, you asked a question, I don't want to.
Guardrails?
Well, no, I mean, I'll skip to it, like, so looking at the tier one, some of the questions I'm gonna be asking myself is, I get where the schools are asking for so many FTEs in tier one. I mean, what their minimum was, it seems like, I mean, we obviously came way lower than that, and their minimum they were gonna cut, so cut. I get why they're adding so many, because they've been cut so much. The town side, there's 9 as well in the tier 1. That seems like a lot. It just seems like a lot. I don't know where I'm going with that, I just.
We had 6 unfunded heads between police and fire, right?
I get unfunded, but I mean, that's, I mean, there were stories about each one of those over the past few years. It's not that they even had the money for some of them, so.
It does seem like the time to add a position is during an override, because
I get it.
you're generally
18's a lot, though.
You're generally cutting when you're not having an
18's a
override
huge
discussion.
number.
Right? It is a lot. On the school side, I would say I can't imagine that they would spend a lot of money on things that aren't positions, just because of the nature of the product that they have. You know, they need teachers and people to do things.
Yeah.
They don't expend.
I'm not
a ton
fighting
of
this out,
money.
I was just making a
Right.
point. I don't know where, you know, I think I have more questions in there.
All right. Others on the guardrails. What's the temperature of the room in terms of the tier ones and going into tier 2 and whatnot?
I believe that they're creating the tiers. I mean, I don't know that we should go around, I mean, that's your priorities. Am I correct in that?
I'd like to know if you think the priorities are reasonable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, not a problem with that at all.
Good.
Yes.
I will point out that in both tier 3s, there's a significant number of those items included on the Capital Improvement Planning Committee request, which we're going to go through on Wednesday. So I'm focusing more on the tier 2 than on the tier 3 for that reason.
What about the lieutenant for the fire department? Can you remind us about?
Who's the training position?
Is
It
that
was a
the
training lieutenant.
He's had that on his list for a long time.
Okay.
And we did call him over to the table the other night, and I would say that he did not make a passionate. It seemed like he understood why it landed on this
He wasn't
priority list
pushing
where
it.
it landed, and he was comfortable with its prioritization. Yes?
I'll respond directly to your question. I do not think we should go beyond 3.8. I can see shoving things around if somebody thinks something on tier 2 is higher, but I don't think we should. We don't know yet, of course, what the selectmen are going to recommend.
Right.
There is reason to believe it may come in lower than the 3.8. I just don't, and it certainly doesn't sound like it's going to come in higher.
Okay.
As I said before, last meeting, I think we've all got to be on the same page here, so.
I agree.
That's true.
So right now, it's 3.88, and you said not higher than 3, you mean not
Yeah,
higher?
the 3.9.
You mean under 3.9?
Thank you.
Okay, so I love having an opinion.
Yeah.
I agree.
You agree, under 3.9. Others?
Yeah, I agree.
Is 3.9 way too high for anybody? Yes, it is way too high for Brian. And Steve, maybe?
It's high.
Possibly, yeah.
In me.
It's high for Phil. So,
I'll put my
okay.
hand up there, too.
Is it beyond your guardrail? You want to bring the number down?
Over the guardrail.
The guardrail. Okay. So then,
So let's be clear, we're asking for a $4 million override, was what we're talking about.
3.9, yep.
Okay, too high.
Okay, so I'm hearing from 5-ish people that 3.9, or just under 3.9 is too high. So that means if we like the prioritized lists, and we're willing to accept
Send it
them.
back.
We could send it back, or we need to go to the prioritized lists and start taking off from the bottom up until we're pleased with the number.
I would rather they went from the bottom.
Yeah, but
I- yeah.
I agree with Jean. I think for a contingent budget, I say leave it to the people who know better than we do,
Yeah.
outside the scope of the dollar. This is different than non-contingent, where we make a passionate plea and we make tough, uncomfortable decisions. In this case, this is them prioritizing their list of what they could have. I would prefer to send it. I don't want to gum up the process. That's not the last thing I want to do. I don't want to create a bottleneck, but I do think they should be the ones to do it.
I got a quick comment.
Yes, Richard?
Just to clarify, what would you be asking for? Because right now, what we just talked about is like tier one for both, getting to that under 3.9. What would you be asking for? I mean, we already have the priority list, or maybe tier ones aren't really prioritized, and what you're asking for is to prioritize that list, so we can start cutting. But shouldn't we come up with an idea of, so if you're gonna ask them to prioritize it, you gotta kind of give them a number, right? So are you looking at 3.8, or is it 3.2, or is it 2.6? Those are very big things
Yeah, they
that you
are.
would be axing a lot of theirs out of.
Maybe we should.
I want to point out that the lists, I waved them up. I want to point out that the lists say that they're prioritized. So my assumption when they were given to us was that if we were going to decrease the number of the contingent budget, we could move up from the bottom, and that would meet your expectations. Glenn, is that assumption correct? Okay.
Correct for the schools.
All right.
I think what Michael Dennehy said when he was here last week was they had done, he and Amy had put it together, but they were going to be discussing it with us tomorrow night. So it's possible it could change a little bit tomorrow night based on the discussion we have. But by and large, I think it's probably a good sign of where we'll wind up.
Okay. All right. So then, let's definitely give the TA some feedback then, if that is the the will of the warrant committee here. If you want to say that 3.8 is too high, what number are you more comfortable with that we would want the TA to reprioritize within?
This is purely selfish because I own my house and I don't want to be taxed out of the town. You know, so I'm trying to think of.
A lot of people feel that.
I think that's the reason why we're citizens.
Yeah, and I want it to pass. So I think if I say, if you say 3.9, they're going to say 4 million back to you. So, I'm thinking more, I would be comfortable with 3 million.
I think Katie said 3.2 to 3.4. I'm not, like,
What did you say, Katie?
When you were speaking
Right,
about
it's
this?
actually, it was David Burns who put out, I think, 3.3 to 3.6 at one of our meeting last week is a ballpark range.
I want to point out that we're walking a fine line of building the budget that we think is appropriate for the town and passing the contingent budget that we think is passable at the ballot box.
Yes.
So I want to make sure that one of our guardrails is that we feel as though we're putting together the best, the budget that the town needs.
Yes.
Yes.
1, 2.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we can take it 2 different approaches here. We could reverse engineer it, set a number, and then work within those parameters, or we could look at the sheet, work our way up from the bottom like you talked about, calibrate the priorities and then end up at a number.
I tried that, but I got shut down.
Those are two. Let's try to balance circle back. Like that, it's past 10 o'clock.
It's not easy because there's, you know, on the school side, you can work your way up. On the other side, you can't, because there's all the other non-selectmen, board of selectmen departments that, you know, stuff that's not yet presented. I don't know.
And also, I think that we may be working at cross purposes, because when they've put these tiers together, they probably put them together with the program. So, you know, knowing that one hand washes the other, and they're buying things for this to be completed and successful. And if we say you can have this and not that, well, we may be disrupting how they are trying to organize their programs.
Betty and then Richard?
Well, I want to also think about projecting out beyond the next year, because oftentimes in the past, when we've planned overrides and we've planned a number that we can pass but that will work, we look to see what will hold us for the next couple of years, because I don't want to come up with too less a number and then next year have a significant deficit again. So I want to look towards our financial experts to kind of say, does this number hold the town for the next couple of years?
Yeah.
And that's where we need some information about, you know, what will that number be?
I'm afraid if
That's a
we
good point.
project that, we're going to come up with an unreasonable override. That's what I'm afraid of.
I had Richard.
No, that's fine. I actually agree with the mixture. There's a couple comments about, you know, I don't know that I agree with going down and up, but I would rather go through the exercise of saying to the town, you know, I'm going to, you know, making this up. You know, I don't think it's 1 million, it needs to be 500,000, and then having them reprioritize that, and then take a hard look at it. Because I feel like you know, and again, just, this is hypothetical, the million cut might be a little, for me, it might be a little high on that side. So, you know, I was in the same boat of around 3.2, somewhere in the neighborhood. And to do that, you'd have to cut that one basically in half.
Yeah, Brian?
Sorry, just one thing I want to take a step back. There are folks at this table that were here during the last override, and I've heard anecdotally that they haven't necessarily been the most successful, and so I think there would be value from the folks who have been through it that can shed some perspective for folks like me who weren't here. What was the inputs to the decision? What were the inputs to the decision when we made it? What would you do differently? Because now is the opportunity to do it, so I do think we need to do some reflection in terms of the last override. Like, what was the composition of the override? Where do we think we went wrong? What worked? Not only what worked in the process to get it approved, but what would we do differently from an execution standpoint? Because like Lee Michael said, I just think some perspective, I think, would be helpful.
Well,
I know a lot has changed, but.
Before somebody jumps in with an answer to that, I believe that the selectman has requested that the town council put on some sort of a, or they are at least discussing the possibility of hosting a information session on what is reasonable and not reasonable for appointed and elected officials to do, because there are specific guidelines in Proposition 2.5 that outline use of town equipment, for instance, in trying to support or not support an override effort. The intention of Proposition 2.5 is for it to be a grassroots sort of community effort, and elected officials are forbidden from using of town resources for supporting an override. So I don't have that knowledge myself, and I worry about what I don't know, I'll admit. And I'll just say that I think we need to check into it.
You don't mean with respect to what we might say here.
No. I mean with respect, Brian started to talk about how we pass an override or how we support one or whatever, and I don't actually know that the Warrant Committee has any role in that. We have to build a budget that we think is appropriate for the town, and then we give the justification for why that budget is necessary or how we came to that determination. But it's not our job to be out leafletting the town that I know of.
And I was more, what are the, it was more, what was the, and my question was more around what was the composition of the overrides? What were past overrides? What were the characteristics of the overrides? What were the compositions like, and how were they doing?
Phil?
I defer to Phil.
Almost every operating override we've ever had, the amount has been what it took to prevent what would otherwise be substantial cuts in service, meaning people. And on a few rare occasions, there have been some new people that might have been added into it. But the thrust of the override and the amount of the override and the campaign in support of it was always, this is what you will lose if you don't come up with this money. This would be the first override if we went, for example, with both priority ones, where we have said the bulk of the override money is for new positions.
Does that align more with
A
what Betty was
a
saying?
substantial number of new positions. We've never done that before. And my own feeling is that it would have a very difficult time passing.
Yeah, I agree.
I had Michael and then Richard.
Yeah, on the subject of the new positions, I looked at how Milton compares to other towns our size, our general economic level. I looked at what the Pioneer Institute says about how we stack up against other towns. And I was chairing this subcommittee on general government, and Milton was spending far less on general government than other towns our size. And I think I would go to the mat to protect the new positions for that, based on just what I looked at. I think it's, this is part of getting more professional, having a town administrator come in telling us we have to run our town a little better. There are things that we don't get because we don't have people to do the job. I mean, I think it's a sin that we have to spend so much time on the bylaws, trying to figure out what our bylaws are, because they're not
Yeah.
readily available,
Mess.
because we don't have anybody who's
Yeah.
taking care of that. So, there's a couple of positions here I think that we should still keep in. I don't know, I mean, Phil made a pretty good point that we always said when we went and did the non-contingent budget, we should have, some more layoffs in public safety. We didn't go for that at the time.
Don't get me
Anyhow.
wrong, I'm not saying that we should necessarily have a budget that has no new positions, but I think we ought to remember that in terms of history, adding new positions in an override year has not been the norm, and especially if we're talking about 10 and 12 positions on the town side and an equal or more number on the school side.
So I have heard, sorry.
Just to follow, I'd be open to cutting some positions, some of the head count. I hear you, what you're saying. But as far as the general government ones,
Yeah.
I think they need them.
Brian?
It has been referenced anecdotally that the overrides
I'm
weren't
sorry.
successful.
I'm sorry, I had Richard
No, I'll go
first.
next, that's fine.
I forgot.
No, that's fine.
Go ahead, Richard.
No, I was going to agree with the comments, because I was thinking similar, but my question is, on the school side, wouldn't you say that those were cut, and those are not
A lot of the
full
positions on the
additions?
school side look to be restorations.
Restorations. So
Some
that's
positions
why-
that they used to have and that they lost.
So that's why my initial comment was, when I'm looking at this, it was, I'm not so worried about the school 1.1 after the 1.5 and the 235 of the group insurance because of that, and I think that's a good conversation you could have. At least, I'm talking to myself in the mirror, I can have a good conversation about the schools, because that's restoring a bunch of stuff. So when you're gonna sit in front of somebody and say, why would you add something? Why are you adding all those positions? Well, we're not. We're trying to get back to the level service that we once had, or what we wanted to have, and we keep eroding. I think the flip side is, and not coming down on the town side, but I feel like that 1.007 number is a bit high.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you, Michael. There's probably some things you gotta keep in there. But there's probably a good chunk that has to come out.
I mean, have we got a better story for sticking to the tier ones? Have we got a better story for that? Because we certainly are underservicing the town. I think that we've seen every budget that came in, they have all had merit. Because if they haven't, we've cut them. So they all
That's what I'm
have
struggling
merit.
with. There's not anything in either tier one that I think is
No. I know.
is
So,
wasteful.
um,
I had Brian and then Katie.
Oh, yeah.
You're done?
No, yeah.
Can I just clarify something about the positions in the town side? And again, we're going to be reviewing them tomorrow night, so there may well be items, or whether it's positions or other services in the town contingent budget that we think might need to be reduced. But over the last number of years, because of the level dollar budgets, there has been a gap that's grown up in a lot of the town services. For example, the zoning officer. That zoning enforcement used to be something that we did, and we just don't have the resources to do it, and that has fallen away, and that's a service that's not being provided. I noticed our former town administrator, John Cronin, is still in the room. When he retired, back, I think, John, 2001? True. The staff of the selectman's office was bigger than it is now, and there have been some changes in that. The former town administrator, Anne Marie Fagan, did a restructuring where the assistant town administrator really took on the full-time human resources work of, some of it had been in the treasurer's office and some of it had been half-time for the assistant town administrator, but we lost the additional half-time assistant town administrator services, and that's why that position was in the budgets. And the police and fire spoke to their unfunded positions that have been approved by the personnel board, sought in many years, and because we've had level dollar budgets, just couldn't be funded. So that's less police on the street in patrolling traffic and being in the summertime, being out on the bike patrols or foot patrols in the business districts, and less firefighters on the trucks than what we'd like to have, and hence the need for more overtime to fill some of those needs. So I wouldn't want anyone watching this to think, well, we're just adding positions that never existed before. In a lot of cases, we're restoring services on the town side too, and some of them are new. The library has made a pretty compelling case that with the new building and the number of people coming to use the library increasing, and the number of middle schoolers and elementary schoolers who use the library after hours, that they have a need for some additional positions in that much larger building, and a building that's providing in a department that's providing much greater services than they used to. So some of it is additions, but a lot of it too is restoration and trying to address gaps in services that have come up because of the budgets that we've been in for the last 6 or 7 years, and it has been 8 years since the last override. So I think that does account for some of it on the town side. Some of these are positions we've wanted to fill and haven't been able to in the last few years.
Steve?
Yeah, whether the override passes or not, anything that's not on the contingent isn't going to get done for some number of years.
Yep.
So, we need to be aware of that. And, I see some things on this that I could cut back on or live without. I'd like to hear from the selectmen first. I'd particularly like to hear where this chief procurement officer falls in, because it's not in any of the 3 tiers, but then there's a request for money for it. So, would that suddenly bump ahead of this assistant for HR or something like that? So, but it's still going to be on us to balance library versus this versus that. And, I don't know. We didn't hear from any of them on this cut list, except I think Will was the only one that I saw that just was in the audience. But, how do we balance the town clerk's needs against something else if it comes down to that? That may be something that we need to do. So we may need to hear from some of these folks again.
Okay. If there's a specific request, yes, ask somebody to come back in. Glenn?
Just to follow up on what Phil said, the times where we have added positions in overrides have either been restorations, or in some cases, we've added positions where we made a claim that they were actually saving us money. I think back to 98 or 99, where we were faced with a huge fire department overtime budget, and we cut back the overtime budget and had them hire 3 firefighters instead, because they had so many people out on vacation all the time. You're always paying people overtime. And so we said, hire 3 new firefighters, pay them straight time to cover the time, cut back your overtime budget. Those sorts of arguments hold weight with the community because they're savings. I think that, the CPO, if done right, could be that sort of an argument too, possibly. So I think there are reasons why positions get added, but generally I think, either a restoration or something that really shows its value monetarily, especially, I think is the easier sell, so to speak. But I think it would be more popular in the sense that we're buying this because it does this for me. We've done it in the past with in inspectional services. I remember adding a position there once upon a time because, again, they didn't have enough people to do inspections, and that's a department that brings in a lot of money. So there are arguments that can be made for a new position that isn't a restoration, but it is an argument that has to be made. It's not just, we'd like this. It's really got to show its value.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to ask the town administrator to reprioritize Tier 1. Probably won't need Tier 2 and Tier 3 by the sounds of it, but to reprioritize Tier 1 and take into account where he and the Board of Selectmen want the Chief Procurement Officer to land on that list, if at all. And with that information, and if there's any specific questions for other departments, we need to know that sooner rather than later. But with that information, we're going to need to create the contingent budget at our next meeting or two. And so it's not up to the school department and the town administrator to make that budget for us. And we're going to have to make those decisions. Unfortunately, I feel like we veered back from our discussion on guardrails. It started to sound like we were bringing the number down from 3.8, and then we went back to there doesn't seem to be much in the Tier 1 requests that we would cut out. We feel like they're justified. So I'm not exactly sure where that leaves us. Maggie?
But I do have a question. Can you remind me once again, item 26, the law general expenditures?
Yeah, that's the one that sticks out to me.
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking. What is that? Do we really need it? It's not a position. What is in there that's so important? Because I'm forgetful at the moment.
The legal budget, we have a lot of cases going on. We have one very big one. We have the Randolph Avenue 40B appeal that's pending and is very active at the moment and will be for the next several months. So we also had increased legal costs in the area of airplane noise. In simple matter that we've got, we have an additional attorney we've brought in, but we have our regular town council who's writing a lot of letters for us, who's responding each year now to the environmental data report. We have the Runway 4L environmental assessment coming up. That's going to be pretty significant in terms of community input and input from the town. So there's a lot of different things that we're working on at any given time, and we foresee that we had to come to the Warrant Committee last year for a pretty substantial reserve fund transfer for the legal budget. And we're, just based on historical precedent and what the last few years have been, we're projecting that will be a higher number. And, we could just come to the reserve fund, but we know that in a tight year, in a reserve fund, probably not with a huge amount to begin with, that's supposed to be for extraordinary or unforeseen expenses.
Right.
And if the legal budget is increasing year to year, then it's something that we thought we reasonably should request a greater amount for.
I guess.
That's where I ended up, Maggie. I'm not a fan of the legal budget having sort of no cap on it, and us just receiving a bill sort of at the end of the year that we couldn't plan for. There's no way for us to say no, because the work has already been done. So if we were to say, no, we're not going to sign that reserve fund transfer, I don't know what happens at that point. But on the other hand, relying on the reserve fund transfer seems fiscally irresponsible because we know the cost of those services has increased, and we're likely to spend this amount of money whether or not it's included in the contingent budget or not. So
I guess at what
better
point,
to be planful.
for example, the airplane traffic, it keeps going up and up and up. I mean, when do you say we're going to have a budget X amount per year? When we go over that, we can't be doing anything else, and we have other things that are going on. We're spending a lot on, yes, everyone wants to have everything perfect, but I think you have to say, how much are we really going to be spending to fight the FAA every single year? Because these costs are going to keep skyrocketing. We're fighting we're fighting City Hall.
We haven't spent any money on that yet.
No, I'm just saying.
I will point out.
It's also the quality of time.
I'll call on Richard, he's very patient.
No, I will say this, though, there are many people in the town that would probably disagree and say it's
I'm
very
sure,
important to
right.
them. And so I just want to clarify, I don't think on the town side or the school side, you guys are putting anything, fluff in or adding anything extra in here. I would be willing to submit that all the way down to tier 3 in both. Maybe that brings you up to level service of where we should be. Where I'm coming from is just the one thing I really like past 5 years around that the Warrant Committee is like collection of very diverse group of folks from the town. This is just my feeling of, as a taxpayer, kind of like Gene was saying, I'm just trying to think in my head, what's palatable for me, you know? As a taxpayer, for where I'm at in my life, and how do I, balance this, or how do we come up with what that is for me, and then, that's just how I look at it. So I wasn't advocating that we're adding any extra people in here. My only point was that, in looking at the schools, I understand where those are coming from. They were literally cuts. There is a lot of positions that are well needed on the town side, but they're new positions. I do have a question though, and I don't know if maybe the answer is just there's nothing, but as we're looking at what's the dollar per thousand, is there anything on like the debt service side that would make 120 really be 110, or is there anything that is coming down over the course of the next 5 years that would make me look at this 120 per thousand differently?
Well, the debt service for the school library projects is falling off every year,
Is-
but
so-
it's a number of years before it'll decrease rapidly.
So for me, that's really important. So if I think of myself over the next 5, 6, 7 years, you might say we're going to add, it's going to add $400 to me, but that's just for the next 2 years, because next, year 3 it's down to 300. Now I get there's other things that could possibly add taxes to it, but it's the other piece of the story that I don't think we're talking about yet.
Not on the non-contingent debt service, I mean, basically the capital committee refreshes that every year as debt falls off. They use it to bring it back up. But on the contingent debt service, the library and the schools, you could look at the schedule to see what kind of savings you might get. The schools by now are starting to crawl down a bit because it's been 10 years. And plus, we just did a refinance on the bonds as well, so that should bring it down as well. So there are some, I don't have the debt service, Amy has it, but
I haven't looked at it in a while, but the capital committee has it.
But I don't think you're going to see $1 million coming off to balance any of this.
Tom Hurley's idea to keep the debt service level and build up some reserves, that's the whole basis of that. The school
Yes.
stuff was gonna drop off, fire stations and,
So my other side of that was, well, if in my head I'm thinking it should be 3.2 without any real work being done on this, well, maybe that's really 3.7, 3.8 because there's extra. That was just my thinking.
I'm feeling, Jane.
Well, you have the answer in your hand. Okay, we have two options. We can return these, we can try and cut them down, although we all seem to agree there's no cutting if we're gonna serve the town. Or we can decide, that's it, you go up to your 3.9, and like I said before, that's our story. That's what it costs to serve the town. And we have certainly the evidence that is there.
Yep.
Those are your two choices.
Well, I do want to see the reprioritized list from the town administrator with the CPO considered, and I have a question for Glenn. On the school contingent list, if we were to make cuts up from the bottom two are transitions, 1.0 sped teacher, additional sped staff in grade 5, co-taught classroom, and then the next one is professional development for $100,000. Is it beneficial to the schools to have some incremental amount of money for professional development if we were to get up to that high and made it $50,000 or $75,000? Do you still get the benefit?
Where you couldn't do half a person, you certainly could do half of the professional
I didn't know
development.
if you had a specific program in mind that
No,
cost a dollar amount.
it's just with a lot of new mandates and new programs coming on, we had some, a lot of the professional development over the last several years had been moved into the so-called advancement budget and funded with one-time funds. So that sort of fell off the table. And plus, a couple of for instance, our Title III grant has decreased a bit and so forth. So this year has, for instance, been a particularly tricky year for professional development. We have about $80,000, and last year's we've had more than double that.
Okay.
So, it would be certainly a refresher of it, but it's not necessarily in that chunk of money. It would be fractional.
Thank you. All right. We're going to dive back into this again on Wednesday night. Besides the reprioritized list, does anybody else have any other questions for the town administrator, Katie, Glenn, the schools?
Do we have any more articles coming from the Board of Selectmen, Katie?
Just the one we mentioned last week, which was the
Anyone?
the
Okay.
traffic stabilization fund. And we expect, obviously, we'll know for sure tomorrow night, but that's the expectation.
Because when we got them, all of the articles sent out, I have a little booklet. And I checked them off. But I don't see anything, and I think this came from your department, we were only talking to Board of Selectmen on the traffic recomposition article.
That's up for tomorrow
Yeah.
night.
Oh, so,
I'm sorry, Wednesday night.
so that will still be coming before us from your, okay.
Wednesday night, yes.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Thank you, Richard.
Raise my hand.